Welcome, young wizard, to a chronicle of shadows and sacrifice that shaped the magical world forever. Tonight, we journey through the Second Wizarding War, the dark years from 1970 to 1981, when Lord Voldemort's reign of terror first gripped Britain. As you settle into your dormitory, let these words carry you through 11 years of courage and loss, when ordinary witches and wizards stood against the darkest magic imaginable. Close your eyes and drift into this tale of the Order of the Phoenix, Death Eaters, and a prophecy that would change everything. Rest now, as we explore the war that preceded The Boy Who Lived. The transformation of Tom Marvolo Riddle into the Dark Lord Voldemort was not accomplished in a single moment of revelation, but through years of careful calculation, methodical corruption, and the systematic abandonment of everything that might have made him human. In the summer of 1945, as the Muggle world celebrated victory over fascism and the wizarding world breathed relief at Grindelwald's defeat, a 17-year-old boy with perfect grades and a charming smile was already planning atrocities that would make both conflicts seem like mere rehearsals for the darkness he would unleash. Tom Riddle's final year at Hogwarts had been a masterpiece of deception, maintaining his facade as the model student, while conducting experiments that would have horrified his professors had they understood their true nature. The Chamber of Secrets had been opened and closed again, leaving behind only whispered rumors and a dead Muggle-born girl whose memory would be twisted to serve his purposes. Hagrid had been expelled, a convenient scapegoat whose simple nature made him perfect for manipulation. Most importantly, Tom had murdered his own father and grandparents, claiming the Gaunt family ring and creating his first Horcrux from the violence of patricide. The diary that would one day possess Ginny Weasley had already been crafted, its pages soaked with the soul fragment torn from him through the murder of Myrtle Warren. He understood, even then, that death was the enemy to be conquered, that immortality was not just desirable but essential for the grand designs taking shape in his brilliant, twisted mind. The other students saw only Tom's academic excellence and prefect's badge, but beneath the surface, something monstrous was learning to wear a human face. His graduation from Hogwarts in June of 1945 should have marked the beginning of a promising career in magical government, or perhaps advanced magical research. Professor Slughorn had offered introductions to influential contacts, while Dumbledore had extended invitations to continue his education through specialized programs. The wizarding world lay open before Tom Riddle like a book waiting to be written, full of possibilities that a witch or wizard of his talents could pursue with every expectation of success and recognition. Instead, he chose a different path entirely. The job he accepted at Borgin and Burke's was beneath his obvious capabilities, a position in the shadowy corners of magical commerce that dealt in objects most respectable wizards preferred to ignore. But Tom understood that knowledge was power, and nowhere in the wizarding world could one learn more about the darkest artifacts and most dangerous magic than in the depths of Nocturne Alley's most notorious establishment. Working for Caractacus Burke gave him access to collections that had been assembled over centuries, objects whose histories were written in blood and whose powers defied the comfortable assumptions of modern magical theory. He learned to identify cursed items by touch, to understand the psychology of collectors who paid enormous sums for artifacts that could destroy them, and most importantly, to trace the provenance of objects back to their creators and original purposes. The knowledge he gained during those years was encyclopedic and terrible. He discovered techniques for soul manipulation that the Ministry had banned so thoroughly that even their names were restricted information. He learned about magical experiments conducted in ages when ethical considerations didn't exist, when wizards treated muggles as subjects for testing rather than beings deserving protection. Each revelation fed his growing conviction that the wizarding world's current moral boundaries were artificial constraints imposed by the weak upon the strong. His theft of Slytherin's locket and Hufflepuff's cup were not mere crimes but declarations of philosophical independence from the laws that governed ordinary witches and wizards. These artifacts belonged to him by right of magical supremacy, by his ability to claim them where others could not. The murders of Hepzibah Smith and others were simply tools for achieving larger purposes, no more morally significant than a farmer slaughtering livestock for dinner. But even as he gathered power and knowledge, Tom understood that transformation required more than mere accumulation of magical artifacts and forbidden techniques. The name Tom Marvolo Riddle carried the stain of Muggle blood, connected him to a father whose weakness and mortality represented everything he sought to transcend. The anagram he created, "I am Lord Voldemort," was not just clever wordplay, but magical metamorphosis, the conjuring of a new identity from the letters of the old. The process of becoming Voldemort was gradual and deliberate. Each Horcrux created representing another step away from human limitation and toward the godlike power he believed was his birthright. The ring's creation had been fueled by rage at his mixed heritage and the poverty that heritage had imposed upon his mother. The diary drew its power from his contempt for those he considered intellectually inferior. The locket and cup were forged through his growing understanding that mercy was weakness and compassion was failure of will. By the early 1950s, Tom Riddle existed only as a memory and a legal name attached to records that fewer and fewer people bothered to consult. Lord Voldemort was becoming the reality, a figure whose reputation preceded him into the darkest corners of magical society, where power mattered more than law and strength determined worth. He began gathering followers, not through the crude methods of threats and intimidation, but through the far more effective approach of offering people what they most desired. The Knights of Walpurgis began as an informal network of former Slytherin students who shared Tom's understanding that the wizarding world's current order was artificial and temporary. Abraxas Malfoy brought wealth and political connections stretching back centuries. Antonin Dolohov contributed knowledge of curse work that had been developed in the darkest periods of Eastern European magical history. Mulciber and Avery offered the brutal enthusiasm necessary for implementing policies that required violence to enforce. These early followers were not yet Death Eaters, but something more subtle and perhaps more dangerous. Intelligent, educated wizards who had concluded that blood, purity, and magical supremacy were logical conclusions rather than prejudiced opinions. They met in drawing rooms and private clubs, discussing philosophy and politics with the same cultured voices they might use to debate Quidditch scores or ministry policy. Their corruption was complete precisely because it felt so reasonable, so civilized, so obviously correct to minds that had been trained to value magical ability above all other human qualities. The ideology that would eventually justify genocide began with academic discussions about the nature of magical inheritance and the logical implications of wizarding superiority. If magic made wizards superior to muggles, the reasoning went, then surely those with stronger magical heritage were superior to those with weaker connections to the magical world. Pure-blood families had preserved their magical strength through centuries of careful breeding, while Muggle-borns represented contamination that weakened the entire magical gene pool. Tom's own mixed heritage made him particularly sensitive to these arguments, driving him to prove his worthiness through demonstrations of power that pure-bloods could admire and fear. He had to be more ruthless than those born to privilege, more brilliant than those educated from childhood in magical traditions, more powerful than those whose ancestors had built the very foundations of wizarding society. His Horcruxes were not just insurance against death, but proof that he had transcended the limitations that defined other wizards. The research he conducted during the 1950s into methods of achieving immortality was comprehensive and horrifying, drawing upon sources that spanned continents and centuries. He studied the techniques used by ancient Egyptian wizards to preserve their consciousness beyond bodily death. He investigated the methods employed by medieval alchemists who claimed to have discovered the secret of eternal life. He explored magical traditions from Asia, Africa, and the Americas, seeking any knowledge that might contribute to his understanding of death and its defeat. The Horcrux ritual he eventually perfected was his own creation, synthesized from fragments of knowledge that no other wizard had been intelligent or desperate enough to combine. The process required not just murder, but a complete rejection of remorse, a splitting of the soul that could only be accomplished by someone who had abandoned every trace of human compassion. Each creation weakened him in some ways while strengthening him in others, trading emotional capacity for magical power and human connection for supernatural endurance. By the mid-1950s, he had established a pattern of operations that would define his approach to building power for decades to come. He would identify promising recruits through careful observation and research, approach them with offers tailored to their specific desires and weaknesses, then gradually introduce them to increasingly extreme ideological positions until they were thoroughly committed to his cause. The process was seductive rather than coercive, making converts feel that they were joining an intellectual elite rather than a terrorist organization. Lucius Malfoy's recruitment exemplified this approach perfectly. The young heir to one of Britain's oldest pure-blood fortunes was approached not with threats or crude appeals to prejudice, but with sophisticated arguments about magical evolution and the natural hierarchy that governed all life. Tom presented himself as a scholar and visionary whose insights into the nature of magic itself could help Lucius achieve the political influence that his family's wealth should have guaranteed, but somehow never delivered. The transformation of bright, ambitious young wizards into fanatical servants of dark ideology was accomplished through a combination of intellectual seduction and gradual moral corruption. Tom would begin with philosophical discussions that seemed academic and abstract, slowly introducing concepts that challenged conventional morality while providing logical frameworks that made evil seem reasonable. By the time his recruits understood where their new beliefs would lead them, they were too committed to retreat without destroying their own sense of identity. The name Death Eaters had not yet been coined. That would come later, when subtlety gave way to open terrorism and philosophical discussions became military operations. But the essential nature of what they would become was already established in those early years when Tom Riddle completed his transformation into Lord Voldemort and began building the network of allies who would help him attempt to reshape the wizarding world according to his vision of magical supremacy. His activities during this period were carefully concealed from ministry attention, operating in the grey areas where politics met crime and business met conspiracy. He had learned from Grindelwald's mistakes, understanding that premature revelation would bring forces to bear against him before he was ready to resist them effectively. The time for open confrontation would come, but first he needed to build the foundation of power that would make victory inevitable rather than merely possible. The late 1950s saw the establishment of safe houses and communication networks that would serve his organization for decades to come. Ancient pure-blood manors with cellars that could serve as prisons, businesses that could launder money and provide covers for illegal activities, contacts within the ministry who could provide advance warning of investigations or legislative changes that might affect his plans. Each element was carefully placed and thoroughly tested, creating redundancy that would allow his network to survive even significant losses. But perhaps the most important development of this period was his recruitment of Severus Snape's mother, Eileen Prince, whose knowledge of potion making would prove invaluable for the biological warfare aspects of his eventual campaign. Through her, he gained access to techniques for brewing toxins that could kill without leaving traces, mind control potions that were more subtle than the Imperious Curse, and enhancement drafts that could temporarily grant ordinary wizards capabilities approaching those of magical creatures. The irony that Eileen's son would eventually become instrumental in his defeat was one that Tom could not have anticipated, though it reflected the fundamental flaw in his understanding of human nature. He assumed that self-interest was the primary motivator for all rational beings, never comprehending that love could inspire sacrifices that defied logical calculation. This blindness to the power of emotional bonds would eventually prove fatal. But during the 1950s, it simply meant that he underestimated the loyalty that some people felt toward causes larger than themselves. By 1960, Lord Voldemort commanded a network of allies and resources that stretched throughout British magical society and beyond. His followers occupied positions in the Ministry, the financial institutions of Diagon Alley, the educational establishment of Hogwarts, and the social hierarchies that determined access to power and influence. He had established contact with dark wizards throughout Europe and beyond, creating international connections that could provide sanctuary if retreat became necessary, or reinforcements if expansion became possible. The decade that followed was devoted to careful expansion and patient preparation for the open warfare that he understood would eventually become necessary. His followers were trained not just in combat magic, but in the psychological techniques needed to break the will of prisoners and the political skills required to manipulate public opinion during the chaos that war would bring. They studied the methods used by successful revolutionary movements throughout history, adapting Muggle techniques for magical application, while developing entirely new approaches that drew upon uniquely magical capabilities. The transformation of the Knights of Walpurgis into the Death Eaters was gradual but inevitable, reflecting the increasing militarization of what had begun as a philosophical movement. The skull and serpent symbol that would become the Dark Mark was developed during this period, along with the magical techniques needed to project it into the sky above crime scenes. The distinctive masks and robes were designed not just for concealment but for psychological effect, creating an appearance that would inspire terror in enemies and solidarity among allies. Training camps were established in remote locations where recruits could learn the practical skills needed for the coming conflict. These facilities, hidden by powerful concealment charms and protected by deadly curses, became laboratories for developing the tactics and techniques that would define Voldemort's approach to warfare. Volunteers submitted to experimental procedures designed to enhance their magical abilities, accepted dark marks that bound them permanently to their master's service, and participated in exercises that gradually eroded their capacity for moral restraint. The first tentative attacks began in the late 1960s, carefully orchestrated to appear random while actually serving strategic purposes that would become clear only years later. Muggle families were murdered in ways that suggested dark arts involvement, creating fear in the non-magical community, while providing training opportunities for Death Eaters who needed to overcome their remaining moral inhibitions. Magical families known for supporting Muggle rights were subjected to harassment and property damage that escalated gradually from annoyance to genuine threat. By 1970, Lord Voldemort was ready to begin the open warfare that would define the next 11 years of wizarding history. His network of followers had been tested through preliminary operations and proven capable of carrying out complex plans under extreme pressure. His understanding of magical combat had been refined through years of research and experimentation into techniques that no other wizard had dared to explore. Most importantly, his transformation from Tom Riddle into something beyond human limitation was complete, leaving behind only the memories of what he had once been and the terrible certainty of what he had chosen to become. The boy who had been sorted into Slytherin House 45 years earlier no longer existed in any meaningful sense. In his place stood a figure whose very presence radiated malevolent power, whose red eyes held no trace of human warmth or compassion, whose voice carried the authority of someone who had looked into the deepest mysteries of magic and emerged with knowledge that no sane wizard would seek to possess. The Second Wizarding War was about to begin, and at its heart was a creature who had sacrificed everything human about himself in pursuit of power that he believed would remake the world according to his will. The stage was set, the pieces were in position, and the first moves of a conflict that would claim thousands of lives and reshape wizarding society forever were about to be made. Tom Riddle's transformation was complete, and Lord Voldemort was ready to show the wizarding world what he had learned during his long years of preparation in the shadows. The summer of 1970 marked the end of pretense and the beginning of open warfare, as Lord Voldemort abandoned the careful subtlety that had characterized his rise to power and unleashed a campaign of terror that would transform British wizarding society from a community of trust into a landscape of fear and suspicion. The decision to emerge from the shadows was not made impulsively, but represented the culmination of decades of preparation, the moment when his network of followers had grown strong enough and his own power had developed sufficiently to challenge the established order directly. The transformation of his organization from the Knights of Walpurgis to the Death Eaters was more than cosmetic rebranding, but a fundamental shift in operational philosophy that reflected their evolution from secret society to military force. The new name carried deliberate menace, chosen to inspire fear in enemies and pride in followers who had dedicated themselves to serving a master who had conquered death itself. The skull and serpent symbol that became their mark was not merely decorative but a magical construct that served as both signature and weapon, projecting their presence into the sky above scenes of violence with an authority that no other organization could match. The first official Death Eater attack occurred on the night of September 15, 1970, when a coordinated assault on 3 separate locations demonstrated capabilities that shocked ministry officials and established Voldemort's organization as a threat requiring immediate and comprehensive response. The McKinnon family estate in Scotland was consumed by fiend fire that burned with supernatural intensity, leaving behind only charred stones and the dark mark hanging like a malevolent constellation above the ruins. Simultaneously, the Bones family encountered attackers who seemed to appear from nowhere, striking with curses that killed instantly and disappeared before oral reinforcements could arrive to investigate. But it was the attack on the Pruitt brothers' home that revealed the true sophistication of Voldemort's new strategy, demonstrating tactical coordination and magical innovation that exceeded anything seen during Grindelwald's War. The Death Eaters didn't simply assault the building, but surrounded it with wards that prevented apparition, while channeling the occupants' attempts to escape into predetermined kill zones, where additional attackers waited in ambush. The magical signature analysis that followed revealed spell combinations that had never been documented before, techniques that seemed to blend traditional dark arts with innovations that pushed the boundaries of what individual wizards should have been capable of achieving. The psychological impact of these simultaneous attacks was precisely what Voldemort had intended, creating the impression of omnipresence and omniscience that would become central to his organization's reputation. If Death Eaters could strike 3 different targets at the same time with such coordination and effectiveness, what did that suggest about their numbers and capabilities? How many other attacks were being planned at that very moment? Which families would be targeted next? And what could anyone do to protect themselves from enemies who seemed to possess supernatural awareness and unlimited resources? The Ministry's response revealed the institutional weaknesses that Voldemort had spent years studying and preparing to exploit. Ministers Eugenia Jenkins and Harold Mincham had based their careers on peacetime administration, managing budgets and negotiating treaties rather than coordinating responses to military emergencies. The Aurora Office, while competent at investigating individual crimes and apprehending conventional criminals, had no experience with asymmetric warfare conducted by opponents who acknowledged no legal or moral constraints. The attempts to increase security through traditional law enforcement methods proved not just inadequate but counterproductive, creating bureaucratic obstacles that hindered legitimate magical activity while providing no meaningful protection against enemies who operated outside normal legal frameworks. Enhanced identification requirements and movement restrictions affected law-abiding wizards far more than criminals who could simply ignore regulations that they had never intended to follow. The result was a gradual erosion of civil liberties that accomplished nothing except making ordinary citizens feel like prisoners in their own communities. But the Death Eaters' strategic genius lay not in their magical capabilities, formidable though these were, but in their understanding of how to weaponize the very diversity that had been one of the wizarding world's greatest strengths. By targeting Muggle-born families and those who supported their integration into magical society, they were able to exploit existing social tensions that had been largely dormant during peacetime, but could be inflamed into active hostility when circumstances became desperate enough. The attacks on Muggle-born children were particularly calculated to create maximum psychological impact while achieving specific strategic objectives. The murder of 7-year-old Marlene Hendricks, whose only crime was displaying accidental magic while playing in a Muggle park, sent shockwaves through communities that had previously felt secure in their belief that children were protected by social conventions that transcended political disagreement. The torture of the Clearwater family, whose successful integration into pure-blood society had made them symbols of progressive values, demonstrated that no amount of social achievement or political correctness could provide protection against enemies who viewed compromise itself as betrayal. These targeting decisions were not random acts of violence, but carefully planned psychological warfare designed to fragment the wizarding community into competing groups that would be more concerned with protecting their own interests than mounting unified resistance. Pureblood families who might otherwise have opposed Voldemort's ideology found themselves reconsidering their positions when Death Eater attacks seemed to focus primarily on others, while leaving traditional magical bloodlines relatively untouched. Half-blood wizards discovered that their mixed heritage made them suspects in the eyes of both sides, trusted fully by neither pure-blood supremacists nor Muggle-born rights advocates. The Death Eaters' recruitment strategy during this period reflected Voldemort's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics, appealing to potential followers through offers of protection and advancement rather than crude ideological indoctrination. Young wizards from pure-blood families found themselves courted with promises of influence and power that their inherited wealth alone couldn't guarantee. Half-bloods were offered the chance to prove their magical worth through service to a cause that valued ability over ancestry, at least in theory. The Dark Mark ritual that bound new recruits to Voldemort's service was presented as an honor rather than a brand, a sign of belonging to an elite organization that understood the true nature of magical power and was willing to use that understanding to reshape society according to natural hierarchies rather than artificial egalitarian principles. The burning sensation that accompanied the mark's application was described as the price of transcendence, the moment when ordinary wizards became something greater through their association with a master who had conquered death itself. But the most insidious aspect of Death Eater recruitment was the way it gradually normalized violence through a process of incremental escalation that made each new atrocity seem like a logical extension of previous actions rather than a fundamental moral boundary being crossed. New recruits might begin with surveillance activities or intelligence gathering, tasks that seemed relatively harmless and could be justified as necessary precautions in dangerous times. From there, they might progress to property damage or harassment, still avoiding direct physical harm to other people while demonstrating their commitment to the cause. The transition from harassment to torture to murder was managed so skillfully that many Death Eaters later claimed they had never intended to become killers, that they had been drawn into increasingly extreme actions through circumstances beyond their control. But Voldemort's genius lay in understanding that moral boundaries, once compromised, became increasingly flexible with each subsequent violation. Someone who could rationalize threatening an innocent family could eventually rationalize murdering that family, given sufficient motivation and social pressure from their peer group. The alliance with dark creatures that characterized this phase of the war was another demonstration of Voldemort's strategic brilliance, turning the wizarding world's traditional prejudices into tactical advantages that multiplied his forces while demoralizing his enemies. Giants had been marginalized by mainstream magical society for centuries, treated as dangerous nuisances to be contained rather than intelligent beings capable of meaningful political relationships. Werewolves faced systematic discrimination that excluded them from most forms of legitimate employment while providing no alternatives except survival through criminal activity. Fenrir Greyback's recruitment was particularly significant because it brought not just an individual ally but access to an entire network of lycanthropes who had been radicalized by their treatment at the hands of supposedly civilized wizarding society. Greyback's philosophy of spreading lycanthropy as widely as possible aligned perfectly with Voldemort's goals of destroying existing social structures, creating chaos that could be exploited for political advantage, while building a constituency of supporters who had no choice but to remain loyal to the only leader who offered them acceptance and purpose. The decision to recruit Dementors represented perhaps the most chilling demonstration of how far Voldemort was willing to go in pursuit of victory, forming alliances with creatures that embodied despair itself and fed upon human happiness. These beings had served as guards for Azkaban prison for centuries, their presence ensuring that incarceration was genuinely punitive rather than merely restrictive. But their loyalty to the ministry was based on convenience rather than conviction, and they proved perfectly willing to transfer their allegiance to anyone who could offer them greater feeding opportunities. The psychological warfare implications of Dementor alliance were staggering, as these creatures could drain hope and happiness from entire communities while leaving no physical evidence of their presence. Families that had never been directly attacked by Death Eaters found themselves overwhelmed by depression and despair that seemed to have no identifiable cause, weakening their resistance to propaganda that promised relief through submission to Voldemort's authority. The very air in magical communities became thick with an oppressive atmosphere that made normal life increasingly difficult to sustain. But perhaps the most devastating weapon in Voldemort's arsenal during this period was not magical but psychological. The systematic destruction of trust that had previously held wizarding society together. The liberal use of the Imperious Curse meant that anyone might be an unwilling agent of the enemy, forced to betray friends and family through magical compulsion that left no external signs of compromise. Husbands suspected wives, parents questioned children, and lifelong friendships dissolved under the weight of uncertainty about who could be trusted with sensitive information. The paranoia that resulted from this strategy served Voldemort's purposes perfectly, fragmenting potential opposition into isolated individuals who were afraid to organize resistance for fear of being infiltrated or betrayed. Community organizations that had previously brought people together for social and charitable purposes found their membership declining, as people became reluctant to associate with others who might be secretly working for the Death Eaters. Even family gatherings became strained affairs where conversation was carefully monitored and sensitive topics were avoided entirely. The Ministry's attempts to counter this psychological warfare through increased use of Veritaserum and other truth detection methods only accelerated the breakdown of social cohesion by creating an atmosphere where everyone was BNN, potentially suspect, and privacy became impossible to maintain. Citizens found themselves subjected to questioning that violated their most intimate thoughts and memories, creating resentment against authorities who seemed more interested in finding scapegoats than protecting innocent people from actual threats. The economic warfare that accompanied the Death Eaters' terrorism was equally sophisticated, targeting the financial institutions and commercial networks that supported Wizarding Society's prosperity and stability. Banks found themselves unable to guarantee the security of their clients' assets when vaults could be breached by magic that exceeded their defensive capabilities. Businesses discovered that their supply chains were vulnerable to disruption by attackers who could strike anywhere and disappear without leaving traces that conventional investigation methods could follow. The result was a gradual contraction of economic activity, as people became reluctant to engage in transactions that might make them targets for Death Eater attention. Shops closed early and opened late, if they opened at all. Trade between communities declined as merchants found the roads increasingly dangerous to travel. Even the magical transportation networks became unreliable, as flu connections were severed and apparition points were compromised by attackers who understood the system's vulnerabilities better than those responsible for maintaining its security. The propaganda war that accompanied these physical and economic attacks was carefully calibrated to exploit existing social divisions while creating new ones that would serve Voldemort's long-term strategic objectives. Death Eater publications appeared throughout magical communities, presenting sophisticated arguments for blood purity that went far beyond crude racial superiority to encompass complex theories about magical inheritance, cultural preservation, and the natural hierarchies that supposedly governed all successful societies. These publications were particularly effective because they contained enough genuine insight about Wizarding Society's problems to give credibility to their more extreme conclusions. The integration of Muggle-born wizards had indeed created social tensions and cultural conflicts that mainstream political leadership had been reluctant to address directly. Traditional magical families were genuinely concerned about the preservation of customs and knowledge that might be lost through excessive accommodation to non-magical sensibilities. By presenting themselves as the only political movement willing to address these legitimate concerns honestly, the Death Eaters were able to attract support from people who might otherwise have found their methods repugnant. Moderate, pure-blood families found themselves drawn into increasingly extreme positions through a process of ideological escalation that mirrored the recruitment techniques used for individual Death Eaters, beginning with reasonable-sounding arguments and progressing gradually toward conclusions that justified any action taken in defense of magical tradition. The international dimensions of Voldemort's strategy during this period revealed his understanding that the conflict in Britain was part of a larger struggle for the future direction of magical civilization worldwide. Death Eater representatives were dispatched to magical communities throughout Europe and beyond, seeking allies who shared similar ideological commitments or could be persuaded to remain neutral, while Voldemort consolidated his control over British wizarding society. The success of these diplomatic efforts varied depending on local circumstances and the political sophistication of the communities being approached, but the overall impact was to isolate Britain's magical government from potential sources of support, while creating opportunities for Death Eater operations that extended far beyond their home territory. Foreign magical governments found themselves reluctant to intervene in what appeared to be an internal British conflict, particularly when Death Eater propaganda presented the struggle as a legitimate political movement, seeking to preserve traditional values against foreign-influenced modernization. By the end of 1971, the Death Eaters had established themselves as a formidable opponent that could not be dismissed as a mere criminal organization or contained through conventional law enforcement methods. Their attacks had demonstrated capabilities that matched or exceeded those of legitimate military forces, while their propaganda had created sufficient doubt about the moral legitimacy of the existing order to prevent unified resistance from emerging naturally. The wizarding world found itself in a state of low-intensity conflict that was neither peace nor open war, a condition of chronic instability that served Voldemort's purposes perfectly by preventing his enemies from mounting coordinated opposition, while allowing him to continue building strength through recruitment and penned alliance building. The stage was set for escalation that would transform this initial phase of terrorism into something approaching conventional warfare, but with magical capabilities that would make the conflict far more devastating than any previous wizarding war in recorded history. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a philosophical movement dedicated to preserving pure blood traditions had become a revolutionary army capable of challenging the established order directly, while what had been a peaceful and prosperous magical society had become a community living under constant threat from enemies who seemed to possess unlimited resources and supernatural awareness of their victims' vulnerabilities. The Second Wizarding War had truly begun, and its ultimate outcome would determine not just the future of British magical society, but the direction of magical civilization throughout the world. The decision to form the Order of the Phoenix emerged from Albus Dumbledore's profound understanding that conventional approaches to combating Voldemort's growing influence were not merely inadequate but actively counterproductive, creating bureaucratic obstacles that hindered resistance while providing no meaningful protection against enemies who operated outside every legal and moral framework that civilized society recognized. The summer of 1971 had brought a series of Death Eater attacks so coordinated and devastating that even ministry officials could no longer dismiss them as isolated incidents perpetrated by a small group of extremists with limited capabilities and unrealistic ambitions. The massacre of the Meadows family in their supposedly secure manor house had demonstrated that traditional protective measures were useless against opponents who understood magical defense systems better than those who designed them. The simultaneous disappearance of 7 ministry employees from their offices within the heart of magical government revealed infiltration so comprehensive that normal channels of communication could no longer be trusted. Most troubling of all was the growing evidence that the Imperious Curse was being used systematically to turn trusted colleagues and family members into unwitting agents whose compromised loyalty might never be detected until it was too late to prevent catastrophic betrayals. Dumbledore's analysis of these developments led him to conclusions that challenged every assumption about how resistance movements should be organized and operated in democratic societies where legal channels remained theoretically available for addressing political grievances. The Death Eaters were not a conventional political opposition that could be defeated through superior arguments or electoral success. nor were they ordinary criminals who could be apprehended through enhanced law enforcement efforts. They represented something entirely new in the history of magical conflict, a revolutionary organization that combined military capabilities with ideological fanaticism and tactical innovation that exceeded anything seen since Grindelwald's War. The Order's founding meeting took place in the depths of September 1971, in a location that had been chosen not for comfort or convenience, but for security advantages that reflected Dumbledore's growing understanding of the precautions necessary for survival in a world where enemies possessed supernatural awareness and unlimited resources. The abandoned warehouse in the magical district of London had been warded so thoroughly that even its existence was hidden from casual observation, protected by spells that made visitors forget they had ever seen the building, unless they possessed specific authorization to enter and remember. The individuals who received invitations to this gathering represented a carefully curated selection of witches and wizards whose capabilities, connections, and moral character made them suitable for the kind of warfare that conventional military doctrine had never anticipated. Mad-Eye Moody brought tactical expertise and paranoid thoroughness that had been proven through years of hunting dark wizards who employed methods that pushed the boundaries of magical possibility. Frank and Alice Longbottom contributed not just their formidable magical abilities, but their understanding of pure-blood social networks that would be essential for intelligence gathering and strategic planning. James and Lily Potter's inclusion reflected Dumbledore's recognition that the conflict would ultimately be decided by the younger generation, those whose lives had been shaped by the current crisis rather than by memories of earlier, simpler times when good and evil seemed more clearly defined. Their recent graduation from Hogwarts gave them current knowledge of how Death Eater recruitment was proceeding among students and recent graduates, while their obvious moral courage and tactical intelligence made them ideal candidates for operations that would require both bravery and judgment under extreme pressure. Sirius Black's recruitment was perhaps the most strategically significant decision of the Order's early development, bringing not just an individual ally but potential access to the most comprehensive collection of dark arts knowledge in Britain through his family's library and connections. His rejection of the Black family's traditional pure-blood supremacist ideology made him uniquely valuable for understanding how Death Eater propaganda appealed to people from his social background, while his personal knowledge of individuals who might be sympathetic to Voldemort's cause provided intelligence that could not be obtained through conventional surveillance methods. The establishment of Number 12 Grimmauld Place as the Order's primary headquarters was a masterpiece of strategic planning that turned the Black family's own prejudices and paranoid security measures into advantages for their plain, ideological enemies. The house's existing protections had been designed to prevent unwanted intrusions by anyone who might threaten pure-blood interests, creating layers of concealment and defense that were so comprehensive that even the Ministry would have difficulty locating the building if they somehow learned of its significance to resistance operations. But more than its security advantages, Grimmauld Place provided psychological benefits that were essential for maintaining morale among people who had volunteered to risk everything in service of a cause that might already be hopeless. The house's obvious wealth and historical significance served as constant reminders that Voldemort's ideology was not inevitably triumphant, that pure-blood families could choose to reject supremacist philosophy and dedicate their resources to protecting the very people that Death Eater propaganda claimed were threats to magical civilization. The Order's organizational structure reflected Dumbledore's understanding that traditional military hierarchies were inappropriate for the kind of conflict they were entering, where success would depend more on individual initiative and creative problem-solving than on the ability to execute predetermined plans according to established doctrine. Each member was expected to function independently when necessary, making tactical decisions without waiting for authorization from higher authority while remaining committed to strategic objectives that served the larger cause rather than personal interests or preferences. The communication systems developed for Order operations pushed magical technology to its absolute limits, creating networks that could maintain contact between operatives without revealing their locations or activities to enemies who possessed sophisticated detection capabilities. The two-way mirrors that became standard equipment for field operations were enhanced with concealment charms that made them invisible to conventional observation while protecting their magical signatures from analysis by hostile forces who might attempt to trace their origins or intercept their transmissions. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of the Order's communication system was its use of Patronus messages, a technique that had been considered purely defensive magic until Dumbledore recognized its potential for secure information transfer between trusted individuals. The personal nature of Patronus creation meant that these messages could not be intercepted or duplicated by enemies who lacked intimate knowledge of the sender's psychological makeup, while their incorporeal nature made them virtually impossible to detect through conventional magical surveillance methods. The recruitment of additional members during the Order's first year of operations was conducted with paranoid care that reflected hard-won understanding of how thoroughly Death Eater infiltration had compromised other organizations that had attempted to resist Voldemort's growing influence. Each potential recruit was subjected to exhaustive background investigation that went far beyond official records, to include psychological profiling and magical signature analysis that could reveal subtle signs of compromise or ideological sympathy that might not be apparent through conventional evaluation methods. The Pruitt brothers, Fabian and Gideon, brought not only their considerable magical abilities, but their extensive knowledge of the ancient pure-blood families whose support would be crucial for any successful resistance to Voldemort's supremacist ideology. Their willingness to risk their inherited social position by openly opposing Death Eater recruiting efforts among their peer group demonstrated the kind of moral courage that was essential for operations that would inevitably expose participants to deadly retaliation from enemies who viewed betrayal of blood solidarity as the ultimate crime deserving the most severe punishment. Marlene McKinnon's recruitment reflected the Order's understanding that effective resistance would require capabilities that went far beyond magical combat and tactical planning to encompass the kind of social and political analysis that could identify Death Eater influence before it manifested as open violence. Her work as a journalist had given her unique insights into how propaganda was being used to reshape public opinion, while her contacts throughout magical media provided opportunities for counter-messaging that could potentially slow the ideological transformation that was making Voldemort's recruitment efforts increasingly successful. The training programs developed for Order members during this formative period went far beyond conventional magical education to encompass subjects that had never been included in official curricula because they dealt with aspects of magical conflict that civilized society preferred to ignore rather than acknowledge. Participants learned not just advanced combat techniques, but psychological methods for resisting mental manipulation, survival skills for operating in hostile territory without magical support, and communication protocols that could maintain operational security, even when participants were captured and subjected to interrogation, using methods that conventional legal systems had never contemplated. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of Order training was the psychological preparation needed for the kind of warfare that Voldemort's forces were pioneering, where traditional distinctions between combatants and civilians were deliberately blurred to maximize psychological impact and prevent opponents from developing effective countermeasures. Order members had to learn to make life and death decisions in situations where innocent people might be used as human shields, where mercy toward enemies could result in the deaths of additional victims, and where the luxury of moral certainty was incompatible with the split-second timing that often determined whether operations succeeded or failed catastrophically. The intelligence-gathering operations that became the Order's specialty during its early years required capabilities that pushed individual magical abilities to their absolute limits, while demanding levels of personal courage that few witches and wizards possessed naturally. Surveillance of Death Eater activities meant penetrating social circles where a single mistake in behavior or speech could result in exposure that would be followed immediately by torture and death, not just for the operative involved, but for anyone who might be suspected of providing support or information. Kingsley Shacklebolt's work within the ministry became particularly crucial as Death Eater infiltration of official channels made normal intelligence sources increasingly unreliable or actively misleading. His position as an Auror gave him access to investigation records and strategic planning documents that revealed the scope of institutional compromise, while providing opportunities for sabotage that could slow Death Eater operations without immediately revealing the source of interference. But this work required maintaining perfect cover over extended periods while watching colleagues and friends fall victim to attacks that he possessed advanced knowledge of, but could not prevent without compromising his ability to gather information that might save many more lives. The first major Order operation took place in December of 1971, when intelligence suggested that Death Eaters were planning coordinated attacks on 3 Muggle-born families during the Christmas holidays. The mission required splitting Order resources among multiple simultaneous objectives while maintaining communication security that would prevent enemies from detecting the intervention until it was too late to adapt their plans. Accordingly, the tactical complexity was enormous, demanding precision timing and flawless execution from operatives who had limited experience working together under combat conditions. The success of this operation, which resulted in the capture of 6 Death Eaters and the prevention of what would have been a massacre of innocent families, demonstrated that Voldemort's forces were not invincible despite their reputation for supernatural awareness and unlimited resources. But the victory came at a price that foreshadowed the terrible costs that would characterize the entire conflict. Benji Fenwick was killed during the assault on the 3rd target, dying to protect children whose names he would never know and whose survival would never be acknowledged in any official record. The psychological impact of Fenwick's death on Order morale was profound and complicated, mixing grief for a fallen comrade with satisfaction at having prevented greater tragedy and determination to continue operations that had proven their effectiveness despite their dangers. His sacrifice became a rallying point for recruitment efforts that brought additional volunteers into an organization whose existence remained secret, but whose actions were beginning to influence the trajectory of the conflict in ways that gave hope to people who had begun to despair that resistance was possible. The intelligence networks that the Order established during its 2nd year of operations created capabilities that rivaled those of official government agencies, while remaining invisible to conventional detection methods that Death Eater infiltrators might use to compromise resistance activities. These networks combined human intelligence gathering with magical surveillance techniques that pushed the boundaries of what individual wizards could accomplish through coordination and resource sharing that multiplied their individual capabilities exponentially. The development of safe houses throughout magical Britain reflected Dumbledore's understanding that effective resistance would require infrastructure that could support long-term operations rather than just responding to immediate crises as they arose. Each location was chosen and protected according to criteria that balanced accessibility for legitimate users with concealment from hostile forces, creating a network of refuges that could serve multiple functions depending on operational requirements and threat levels. But establishing these safe houses required resources that stretched the Order's capabilities to their limits, demanding not just financial support, but the kind of magical expertise that was normally available only to institutional organizations with decades of accumulated knowledge and experience. The ward schemes that protected each location had to be crafted individually according to local magical conditions and specific security requirements, while the concealment charms that hid them from detection required constant maintenance and periodic renewal that consumed enormous amounts of time and magical energy. The recruitment of Remus Lupin represented perhaps the Order's most controversial decision during this formative period, bringing into their ranks someone whose lycanthropic condition made him automatically suspect in the eyes of conventional magical society, while providing unique capabilities that could prove invaluable for certain types of operations. His knowledge of werewolf communities that were being recruited by Death Eater agents gave the Order insights into Voldemort's alliance-building efforts that could not be obtained through any other source, while his personal experience with social marginalization helped him understand how extremist recruitment exploited legitimate grievances to build support for illegitimate solutions. But Lupin's inclusion in Order operations also created security vulnerabilities that required constant vigilance and careful management to prevent compromise of sensitive information during periods when his transformed state made him temporarily unreliable. The precautions necessary for managing these risks consumed resources and created operational complications that some members questioned. Though Dumbledore's insistence on inclusion rather than exclusion reflected his philosophical commitment to judging individuals by their choices rather than their circumstances. The propaganda war that the Order waged against Death Eater messaging efforts required capabilities that went far beyond magical combat to encompass sophisticated understanding of how public opinion could be influenced through information, campaigns that operated below the threshold of conscious awareness. Counter-recruitment efforts among Hogwarts students and recent graduates demanded approaches that could compete with Death Eater promises of power and advancement, while offering alternative visions of magical society that were both realistic and inspirational. These efforts were particularly challenging because Death Eater propaganda contained enough legitimate criticism of existing social problems to give credibility to their more extreme solutions, requiring Order responses that acknowledged genuine grievances while demonstrating that violent revolution was neither necessary nor likely to produce the improvements that recruits were seeking. The complexity of these arguments made them difficult to communicate through simple slogans or emotional appeals, requiring sustained educational efforts that were hard to maintain when participants were simultaneously engaged in dangerous military operations. The Order's second year concluded with intelligence, suggesting that Voldemort was preparing to escalate the conflict to levels of violence that would transform what had been a series of terrorist attacks into something approaching conventional warfare between organized forces with substantial capabilities and competing visions for the future of magical civilization. The implications were staggering. Not just the immediate threat to Order members and their families, but the possibility that magical Britain itself might become uninhabitable for anyone who opposed supremacist ideology or simply wanted to live according to principles of tolerance and inclusion. But by this point, the Order had evolved from Dumbledore's initial vision of a small resistance group into something approaching a shadow government, with capabilities that matched those of official institutions and commitment that exceeded what any salary, or legal authority could inspire. They had demonstrated that Voldemort's forces could be opposed successfully, that Death Eater operations could be disrupted and their recruitment efforts could be countered through sustained effort and intelligent planning. Most importantly, they had proven that ordinary witches and wizards could find extraordinary courage when circumstances demanded it, that the values of magical civilization were worth defending regardless of the personal costs that defense might require. The foundation had been laid for the expanded conflict that everyone understood was coming. And while the Order remained vastly outnumbered and outgunned compared to Death Eater forces, they possessed something that their enemies could never replicate: the moral authority that came from fighting to protect others rather than to dominate them, and the unity that emerged from shared commitment to principles larger than individual survival or advancement. The war was about to enter a new and more terrible phase, but the resistance was ready to meet whatever challenges that escalation would bring. The years from 1972 to 1979 would be remembered as the darkest period in modern wizarding history, when terror became so commonplace that families planned their daily routines around avoiding public spaces during certain hours, when children learned to cast protective charms before they mastered basic levitation, and when the simple act of trusting a neighbor or colleague required courage that many people discovered they did not possess. The escalation that had begun with coordinated attacks on individual families evolved into something approaching systematic warfare against the very foundations of magical civilization itself. The transformation of Death Eater strategy during this period reflected Voldemort's growing confidence in his organization's capabilities and his understanding that half measures would not achieve the complete social transformation that his ideology demanded. Where earlier attacks had been designed primarily for psychological impact, creating fear and uncertainty while building Death Eater reputation for supernatural effectiveness, the new phase of operations aimed at nothing less than the complete destruction of existing social structures and their replacement with arrangements that would make resistance impossible rather than merely difficult. The massacre of the entire Bones family in March of 1973 demonstrated the systematic thoroughness that would characterize this new approach to revolutionary warfare. Edgar Bones, his wife, and their 3 children were not simply murdered, but subjected to prolonged torture that served no tactical purpose except to send a message about the fate awaiting anyone who opposed Death Eater expansion. The magical forensic analysis that followed revealed evidence of experimental curses that pushed the boundaries of what individual human beings could survive, suggesting that the victims had been used as test subjects for techniques that would later be employed against larger populations. But the Bones massacre was significant not just for its cruelty, but for its timing and target selection, demonstrating Death Eater intelligence capabilities that exceeded anything the Ministry had suspected was possible. Edgar Bones had been working in secret to develop new protective ward schemes that might provide better security for vulnerable families, consulting with curse breakers and defense specialists whose identities were known only to a handful of trusted colleagues. The precision with which Death Eaters struck at his family suggested either supernatural awareness of activities that should have been completely concealed, or infiltration so comprehensive that even the most sensitive resistance operations were being monitored in real time. The psychological impact of this revelation was devastating for Order morale and operational security, forcing a complete reassessment of communication protocols and operational procedures that had been developed under assumptions about enemy capabilities that were proving to be dangerously inadequate. If Death Eaters could monitor secret research projects and identify participants despite elaborate concealment measures, what other Order activities might be compromised? how many operations had been allowed to proceed only because enemies found it tactically advantageous to gather intelligence about resistance capabilities rather than prevent specific missions from succeeding. The simultaneous attacks on 5 different ministry offices in August of 1973 revealed the extent to which Death Eater infiltration had compromised official governmental functions at every level, from clerical support to senior policy-making positions. The coordinated timing suggested communication systems that operated parallel to official channels, while the precision with which sensitive documents were targeted indicated detailed advanced knowledge of where crucial intelligence was stored and how it could be accessed most efficiently. But perhaps most troubling was the evidence that some attacks had been facilitated from within, requiring cooperation from ministry employees whose loyalty had been compromised through methods that left no detectable traces of magical compulsion or mental manipulation. These individuals appeared to have made conscious decisions to assist Death Eater operations, suggesting that Voldemort's ideology was gaining support among people whose positions gave them access to information and resources that could be weaponized against their own colleagues and departments. The recruitment techniques that produced these internal allies represented a sophisticated evolution from the crude intimidation and ideological appeals that had characterized earlier Death Eater expansion efforts. The new approach combined careful psychological profiling with offers tailored to individual weaknesses and desires, creating relationships that felt voluntary even when they were fundamentally exploitative. Ministry employees found themselves drawn into what seemed like ordinary social relationships with charming, intelligent people who gradually introduced ideas that seemed reasonable and patriotic, until suddenly they were providing information that facilitated attacks on their own workplaces. The Imperious Curse remained a constant threat that poisoned every relationship and made normal social interaction increasingly difficult to maintain. But the more insidious danger came from people who had chosen their allegiances freely and could therefore be trusted with sensitive information and responsibilities that would be denied to anyone suspected of magical compulsion. These voluntary collaborators were often more valuable to Death Eater operations than controlled puppets because their behavior appeared natural and their access to restricted information seemed legitimately earned rather than suspiciously comprehensive. The attack on Street Mungo's Hospital in February of 1974 crossed moral boundaries that even seasoned Aurors had not imagined Death Eaters would be willing to violate, demonstrating that Voldemort's forces acknowledged no sanctuary and respected no tradition of protecting non-combatants that might limit their tactical options. The assault was not designed to capture specific individuals or steal particular resources, but to maximize casualties among patients and staff who represented some of the most vulnerable members of magical society. The magical techniques employed during this attack revealed innovations in curse work that suggested access to research facilities and experimental subjects that could not be explained through normal channels of magical education or traditional dark arts instruction. The wounds inflicted on survivors showed evidence of spell combinations that should have been impossible for individual wizards to maintain simultaneously, while the magical residue analysis revealed energy signatures that matched nothing in existing classification systems. But the most horrifying aspect of the Street Mungo's attack was its duration and the evidence it provided about Death Eater psychology and training methods. The assault continued for over 6 hours, during which attackers had multiple opportunities to withdraw after achieving any reasonable tactical objective. Instead, they systematically worked through the hospital's wards, apparently taking time to experiment with different torture techniques on patients who posed no possible threat to their operations or their cause. The Order's response to this atrocity marked a turning point in their own operational philosophy, as even the most morally scrupulous members began to accept that conventional rules of engagement were inadequate when facing enemies who treated mass murder as recreational activity. The authorization for Order members to use unforgivable curses when necessary was not granted lightly, but the alternative was accepting continued massacres of innocent people while limiting resistance forces to methods that had proven inadequate for preventing such tragedies. Mad-Eye Moody's capture and interrogation of Antonin Dolohov following the street. Mungo's attack provided the first detailed intelligence about Death Eater training methods and organizational structure that revealed the scope of Voldemort's preparations for total war. The information extracted through methods that pushed legal boundaries revealed training facilities hidden throughout Britain, where recruits were systematically desensitized to violence through participation in increasingly extreme activities that gradually eroded their capacity for moral restraint. These facilities operated according to principles that transformed the Death Eater organization from a terrorist group into something approaching a military force with specialized units trained for different types of operations. Assassination specialists learned techniques for killing that left no magical traces that could be analyzed by investigators. Interrogation experts developed methods for extracting information that were more effective than Veritaserum, while being far more psychologically damaging to their subjects. Propaganda specialists studied techniques for manipulating public opinion that combined magical compulsion with sophisticated understanding of mass psychology. But perhaps most disturbing were the reports of experimental programs designed to enhance Death Eater capabilities through magical modifications that permanently altered participants' physiology and psychology. Volunteers submitted to procedures that increased their magical power while reducing their capacity for empathy and moral reasoning, creating warriors who could employ the most horrific curses without experiencing the psychological stress that limited normal wizards' effectiveness in combat situations. The recruitment of giants into Death Eater service represented a strategic escalation that threatened to shift the military balance of the conflict in ways that conventional magical resistance might not be able to counter effectively. These creatures brought not just their enormous physical strength, but their resistance to most forms of magical attack, creating tactical challenges that existing Order capabilities were not designed to address. Their alliance with Voldemort also provided psychological advantages that went beyond their military value, demonstrating that the Dark Lord could command loyalty from beings that the established magical order had marginalized and neglected. Hagrid's diplomatic mission to the giant communities revealed the sophistication of Death Eater recruitment efforts among non-human magical beings, offering not just immediate material benefits but long-term political arrangements that addressed legitimate grievances about their treatment by mainstream wizarding society. The giants had been driven into increasingly remote and inhospitable territories by policies that prioritized human magical convenience over justice for creatures whose intelligence and cultural complexity deserved better recognition and protection. The failure of this diplomatic mission, despite Hagrid's genuine commitment and Dumbledore's reputation for fairness in dealing with non-human beings, demonstrated how effectively Death Eater propaganda had exploited decades of institutional neglect and discrimination. The giants had concluded that their survival required alliance with forces that promised radical change, rather than continued marginalization by authorities whose reformist rhetoric had never translated into meaningful improvements in their living conditions or legal status. The werewolf recruitment crisis that peaked during 1975 revealed similar patterns of systematic exploitation by Death Eater organizers who understood how to transform legitimate grievances into support for illegitimate solutions. Fenrir Greyback's influence among lycanthropic communities was based not just on fear of his violent reputation, but on his ability to articulate critiques of wizarding society's treatment of werewolves that resonated with people whose lives had been destroyed by discrimination that was both legal and socially acceptable. The transformation of individual werewolves from victims of prejudice into willing participants in Death Eater operations was facilitated by policies that made legitimate employment impossible while providing no alternative means of survival except criminal activity. Young lycanthropes found themselves forced to choose between starvation and association with illegal organizations, while older werewolves discovered that decades of social marginalization had left them with no stake in preserving a system that had never offered them justice or opportunity. Remus Lupin's work among these communities on behalf of the Order provided crucial intelligence about Death Eater recruitment methods, while demonstrating that alternative approaches to lycanthropic integration were possible. But his efforts were hampered by the same institutional prejudices that had made Greyback's message appealing to desperate people seeking any form of acceptance and purpose. The tragic irony was that Order policies toward werewolves were significantly more enlightened than mainstream wizarding attitudes, but this advantage was undermined by their inability to offer the kind of immediate material support that Death Eater Alliance provided. The Dementor defection from Azkaban prison represented perhaps the most strategically devastating development of the entire conflict, depriving the Ministry of its most secure detention facility while providing Death Eater forces with allies whose capabilities went far beyond conventional magical combat. These creatures brought not just their ability to drain happiness and hope from their opponents, but their intimate knowledge of Azkaban's security systems and the psychological profiles of prisoners who might be recruited for Death Eater service upon their release. The mass breakout that followed Dementor Alliance with Voldemort's forces released some of the most dangerous criminals in magical history, while demonstrating that no location previously considered secure could be relied upon to contain enemies whose resources and capabilities exceeded anything the wizarding legal system had been designed to handle. The freed prisoners included not just Death Eaters who had been captured during earlier operations, but criminals whose expertise in various forms of dark arts could significantly enhance Voldemort's operational capabilities. But the psychological impact of Dementor defection exceeded even its immediate tactical consequences, as these creatures' presence in Death Eater operations created an atmosphere of despair that weakened resistance morale, while making normal life increasingly difficult to sustain for anyone who opposed Voldemort's expansion. Communities that had never been directly attacked found themselves overwhelmed by depression and hopelessness that seemed to have no identifiable cause, creating conditions that made Death Eater recruitment more successful, while reducing the likelihood that potential victims would take effective precautions for their own protection. The economic warfare that accompanied these military and psychological operations was designed to create social chaos that would make existing governmental structures impossible to maintain, while opening opportunities for Death Eater takeover of essential services and institutions. Attacks on Gringotts Bank and other financial institutions undermined confidence in the stability of magical currency, while demonstrating that even the most secure vaults could be breached by enemies who possessed sufficient knowledge and resources. The disruption of magical transportation networks through coordinated sabotage made normal commerce increasingly difficult, while forcing people to remain in local communities where they were more vulnerable to Death Eater intimidation and recruitment efforts. Flu powder shortages created by attacks on manufacturing facilities isolated magical households from support networks, while making emergency communication more difficult when communities came under direct assault. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this economic warfare was its impact on magical education, as Hogwarts and other schools found their operations increasingly disrupted by security concerns and resource shortages that made normal academic instruction nearly impossible to maintain. Students from families targeted by Death Eater operations were withdrawn from school for their own protection, while others found their education interrupted by emergency closures and evacuation procedures that became routine rather than exceptional. The result was an entire generation of young witches and wizards whose magical education was incomplete and whose understanding of wizarding society was shaped primarily by conflict rather than the cultural traditions and intellectual achievements that had previously defined magical civilization. These educational disruptions created long-term consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate military conflict, potentially damaging the foundations of magical knowledge and social cohesion in ways that might require decades to repair even if Death Eater forces were ultimately defeated. The Order's intelligence operations during this period revealed the international dimensions of Voldemort's strategy, with Death Eater representatives conducting recruitment and alliance-building activities throughout Europe and beyond, while seeking to isolate British magical government from potential sources of foreign support. These diplomatic efforts were surprisingly successful, as many foreign magical governments preferred to remain neutral in what they viewed as an internal British conflict rather than risk becoming targets for Death Eater retaliation. The international magical community's reluctance to intervene was partly based on legitimate concerns about sovereignty and the precedent that intervention might set for future conflicts, but it was also influenced by Death Eater propaganda that presented their cause as a traditional conservative movement seeking to preserve authentic magical culture against foreign-influenced modernization. This messaging was particularly effective in societies where similar tensions existed between traditional magical communities and advocates for greater integration with non-magical populations. The failure to secure meaningful international support left British magical resistance forces effectively isolated while facing enemies who could draw upon resources and expertise from throughout the global magical community. Death Eater recruitment in other countries provided not just additional personnel but access to magical traditions and techniques that were unknown in Britain, giving them tactical advantages that domestic resistance could not easily counter through their own innovations and adaptations. By 1978, the cumulative impact of these various Death Eater strategies had transformed British magical society into something that previous generations would have found unrecognizable and horrifying. Normal social interactions had been poisoned by suspicion and fear that made community cooperation increasingly difficult, while economic disruptions had created shortages and hardships that affected even families who had never been directly targeted by terrorist attacks. The psychological toll on ordinary wizarding families was enormous, as parents struggled to protect children who were growing up in a world where playground games might be interrupted by dark mark appearances, and bedtime stories had been replaced by discussions of emergency procedures and protective spells. The simple pleasures that had previously defined magical childhood were becoming memories rather than experiences, replaced by premature awareness of dangers that no child should have had to consider or understand. Yet even in this atmosphere of pervasive terror and systematic oppression, acts of courage and kindness continued to demonstrate that the human spirit could not be completely broken by even the most comprehensive campaigns of intimidation and violence. Teachers continued to educate students despite personal risk and institutional chaos. Healers treated victims regardless of their blood status or political affiliations, and ordinary citizens found ways to help neighbors and strangers who needed assistance even when providing such help might attract Death Eater attention. The Order's operations during this period reflected both the desperate circumstances they faced and the remarkable dedication of people who had chosen to resist despite understanding that their chances of survival, let alone victory, were diminishing with each passing month. Their missions became increasingly dangerous as Death Eater capabilities expanded, while their resources were stretched to breaking points by the need to protect growing numbers of vulnerable individuals and families who had nowhere else to turn for assistance. The personal costs accumulated relentlessly among Order members, as friends and colleagues fell victim to Death Eater attacks, while survivors struggled with guilt about those they had been unable to protect and uncertainty about whether their sacrifices were accomplishing anything meaningful. The war was consuming everything they valued while offering no clear path toward victory or even survival. Yet they continued fighting because the alternative was accepting the triumph of evil that they could not reconcile with their fundamental beliefs about justice and human dignity. The terror had reached its peak, but the worst was yet to come, as prophecy and destiny began to converge in ways that would transform the conflict from a war of attrition into a struggle whose outcome would be determined by forces beyond anyone's ability to predict or control. The autumn of 1979 brought with it an unseasonal chill that seemed to penetrate deeper than mere weather, as if the very air itself had been contaminated by the despair and violence that had consumed British wizarding society for nearly a decade. It was during this period of deepening darkness that fate chose to reveal itself through the most unlikely of messengers, Sybil Trelawney, a descendant of the famous seer Cassandra Trelawney, whose genuine gift for prophecy had been largely obscured by years of theatrical nonsense and manufactured dramatics that made most serious wizards dismiss her as a charlatan seeking attention through elaborate pretense. The interview that would change the course of magical history took place in the private dining room of the Hog's Head Inn, a location chosen not for its comfort or discretion, but because its reputation for harboring unsavory characters made it the sort of place where unusual meetings would attract no particular attention from casual observers. Albus Dumbledore had agreed to meet with Trelawney, out of professional courtesy rather than genuine expectation, understanding that the divination position at Hogwarts needed to be filled, but holding little hope that this candidate would prove more suitable than the succession of frauds and fantasists who had previously sought the post. The conversation had proceeded predictably for the better part of an hour, with Trelawney offering the usual collection of vague predictions and theatrical warnings that characterized most self-proclaimed seers seeking employment in respectable magical institutions. Her affected manner of speech and tendency toward dramatic gestures reinforced Dumbledore's initial assessment that she was simply another opportunist, hoping to secure comfortable employment through exploitation of popular fascination with prophecy and fortune-telling. But as the interview drew toward its inevitable conclusion, something fundamental shifted in both the atmosphere of the room and the nature of Trelawney's presence, as if she had suddenly become a conduit for forces that existed far beyond her conscious awareness or control. Her voice changed, taking on resonances that seemed to emerge from depths of knowledge and authority that no individual human mind could contain, while her eyes lost their normal focus and appeared to be seeing events that existed outside the boundaries of present reality. The words that emerged from her lips during those crucial moments were not her own, but belonged to whatever cosmic intelligence had chosen to speak through her, delivering a message whose implications would echo through the remaining years of the war and beyond. The prophecy itself was brief but comprehensive, encompassing past, present, and future in language that was both cryptically poetic and devastatingly precise about the forces that were converging toward a confrontation that would determine the fate of magical civilization itself. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. The Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord will be born as the 7th month dies, The immediate aftermath of this pronouncement was marked by Trelawney's return to normal consciousness with no apparent memory of what she had said, leaving Dumbledore as the sole witness to a revelation whose authenticity was confirmed by the magical resonance that still lingered in the air around them. The prophetic energy that had filled the room during those crucial seconds was unmistakable to anyone with sufficient sensitivity to magical emanations, carrying the distinctive signature of genuine divination rather than the artificial theatrics that characterized most fortune-telling performances. But unbeknownst to either Dumbledore or Trelawney, their private moment had not been as private as the circumstances suggested, for Severus Snape had been concealed behind the inn's inadequate soundproofing, initially present for reasons that had nothing to do with prophecy, but everything to do with his ongoing service to Lord Voldemort and his assignment to gather intelligence about Order activities and personnel. His presence in the Hog's Head that evening was the result of careful surveillance rather than coincidence, part of a broader Death Eater operation designed to monitor Dumbledore's movements and identify potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited for tactical advantage. The portion of the prophecy that Snape overheard was incomplete, but sufficient to convey its essential meaning about a child whose birth would herald the beginning of Voldemort's downfall, though the specific details about timing and identity remained unclear enough to require further investigation and analysis. His report to his master would set in motion a chain of events whose consequences would prove far more devastating than anyone could have anticipated, as Voldemort's interpretation of the prophetic words would lead him to focus his attention on eliminating a threat that might never have materialized if left undisturbed. The Dark Lord's reaction to this intelligence revealed both his greatest strength and his fundamental weakness, the combination of strategic brilliance and paranoid insecurity that made him simultaneously formidable and vulnerable to the kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that his own actions would create. Rather than dismissing the prediction as unreliable or attempting to verify its authenticity through additional sources, Voldemort immediately began preparations for locating and eliminating the prophesied child, understanding intuitively that prophecies possessed power beyond their literal meaning, and that ignoring this warning could prove fatal to his ambitions. The analysis of potential candidates that followed demonstrated the methodical thoroughness that characterized Voldemort's approach to eliminating threats, as his intelligence network was deployed to identify all magical children born during the specified time period whose parents had demonstrated sufficient courage and capability to defy him 3 times and survive the experience. The criteria was surprisingly restrictive, eliminating most possibilities and focusing attention on a small number of families whose circumstances matched the prophetic requirements with disturbing precision. The Longbottom family emerged as one obvious candidate, as Frank and Alice had established reputations as formidable auras whose resistance to Death Eater expansion had resulted in multiple direct confrontations with Voldemort himself during operations that had inflicted significant casualties on his forces, while demonstrating tactical capabilities that exceeded anything their official training should have provided. Their son Neville, born on July 30th, fit the temporal requirements perfectly, while his magical lineage suggested he might indeed possess the power necessary to pose a genuine threat to someone who had achieved practical immortality through Horcrux creation. But it was the Potter family that ultimately attracted Voldemort's primary attention, as James and Lily had not only defied him through their Order activities, but had done so in ways that seemed to demonstrate supernatural awareness of his plans and capabilities that suggested either extraordinary luck or access to intelligence sources that his own security measures should have made impossible. Their escape from multiple Death Eater operations that should have resulted in their capture or death had become legendary within both Order and Death Eater circles, contributing to their reputation as charmed individuals whose survival might indeed be linked to prophetic protection. The birth of Harry Potter on July 31st completed the temporal requirements, while adding additional significance through his parents' continued defiance of Death Eater expansion, despite increasing personal danger, diminishing hope for ultimate victory. The intelligence reports that reached Voldemort about the infant's magical displays during his earliest months suggested capabilities that exceeded normal developmental patterns, though whether this represented genuine prophetic significance or simply the natural variation that occurred among magical children remained unclear. The decision to target Harry rather than Neville was influenced by factors that went beyond strict interpretation of prophetic requirements to encompass Voldemort's psychological preferences and strategic calculations about which elimination would provide maximum tactical advantage. The Potter family's prominence within Order leadership made their destruction potentially more demoralizing to Resistance morale, while James's pure-blood heritage combined with his blood traitor ideology made him a particularly satisfying target for someone whose worldview was built around punishment of those who betrayed their proper social position. But perhaps the most significant factor in this targeting decision was Lily's blood status as a Muggle-born witch whose magical abilities and intellectual achievements challenged fundamental assumptions about blood purity that formed the ideological foundation of Death Eater philosophy. Her elimination would serve not just tactical purposes but symbolic ones, demonstrating that even the most talented Muggle-born individuals were ultimately powerless against properly organized pure-blood supremacy, backed by sufficient magical force and political determination. Severus Snape's growing horror at the implications of his intelligence report created psychological conflicts that would ultimately transform him from loyal Death Eater into desperate double agent. Though the process was gradual and motivated more by personal attachment than philosophical conversion, his obsession with Lily Evans had persisted throughout his adult years despite her marriage to James Potter and his own commitment to ideologies that classified her as racially inferior and politically dangerous, creating internal contradictions that had been manageable as long as they remained abstract rather than immediately threatening to her survival. The realization that his information had placed Lily directly in Voldemort's crosshairs forced him to confront the logical consequences of beliefs he had embraced without fully considering their practical implications for people he cared about personally. The Death Eater philosophy that justified eliminating Muggle-born threats to magical purity was intellectually coherent until it required killing someone whose existence gave meaning to his own, creating a crisis of conscience that no amount of ideological training had prepared him to resolve. His initial attempts to protect Lily, while remaining loyal to Voldemort, demonstrated the psychological compartmentalization that allowed intelligent people to serve evil causes while maintaining their sense of moral legitimacy through selective application of ethical standards. Snape's request that his master spare Lily's life while proceeding with the elimination of James and Harry revealed his ability to rationalize genocide as acceptable policy while treating individual cases as special circumstances, deserving different treatment, a form of moral blindness that characterized many Death Eaters who convinced themselves that their personal exceptions proved their underlying humanity rather than their fundamental corruption. Voldemort's response to this request was characteristically manipulative, offering to spare Lily if she cooperated by standing aside during the attack, while making it clear that her survival would depend entirely on his continued goodwill rather than any binding agreement or moral obligation. This conditional mercy served multiple purposes, maintaining Snape's loyalty through apparent consideration for his feelings, while preserving tactical flexibility that would allow Lily's elimination if circumstances made her survival inconvenient or dangerous to broader Death Eater interests. But Snape's recognition that Voldemort's promise was worthless drove him to seek additional protection through alternative channels, leading to the desperate approach to Dumbledore that would transform him from enemy into asset despite years of mutual hostility and ideological opposition. The meeting between these two unlikely allies took place in circumstances that emphasized the extraordinary nature of their arrangement, as Snape was forced to reveal his genuine emotions and motivations to someone who had every reason to view him as irredeemably corrupted by his Death Eater associations. Dumbledore's decision to accept Snape's offer of cooperation was based on calculations that went far beyond the immediate tactical advantages of having an agent within Voldemort's inner circle to encompass deeper understanding of how redemption might be achieved through service that transcended personal motivation. The protection he offered in exchange for Snape's intelligence was comprehensive, covering not just Lily, but her entire family, while demanding in return information that could save countless other innocent lives through disruption of Death Eater operations. The intelligence that Snape provided about Voldemort's interpretation of the prophecy and his targeting decisions gave Dumbledore crucial advance warning about threats that would otherwise have remained hidden until too late to prevent. But it also revealed the impossible nature of the choice that fate had imposed upon a generation of magical children. Either Harry or Neville would have to face a destiny that no child should bear, confronting an enemy whose power exceeded anything in recorded magical history, while carrying the hopes and fears of an entire civilization on shoulders far too young to understand the weight of such responsibility. The protective measures that Dumbledore implemented in response to this intelligence were comprehensive but necessarily imperfect, as absolute security was impossible when facing enemies who possessed unlimited resources and supernatural awareness of their target's activities and vulnerabilities. The Fidelius charm represented the most sophisticated concealment magic available to the wizarding world, but its effectiveness depended entirely on the reliability of human beings whose loyalty might be compromised through methods that no magical protection could prevent or detect. The selection of secret keepers for the families at risk became exercises in psychological analysis and trust evaluation that pushed human judgment to its absolute limits, as the individuals chosen would literally hold the lives of entire families in their hands while facing pressures and temptations that few people had ever been asked to resist. The theoretical security provided by the Fidelius charm was absolute, but the practical security was only as strong as the weakest link in the chain of human relationships that made the spell possible. James and Lily's initial preference for Sirius Black as their secret keeper was based on friendship and trust that had been proven through years of shared danger and mutual support, but it was also influenced by his reputation for absolute loyalty and physical courage that made betrayal seem psychologically impossible. His background as a member of one of Britain's oldest pureblood families who had rejected his heritage in favor of order values seemed to provide additional assurance that his commitment to protecting Harry would be total and unwavering. But the last-minute switch to Peter Pettigrew was motivated by tactical considerations that seemed logical, given their understanding of Death Eater capabilities and targeting preferences, as Sirius's prominence within Order leadership made him an obvious suspect for Secret Keeper duties, while Peter's less visible role might provide better concealment for the actual location of the protected family. The deception was designed to confuse Death Eater intelligence while providing additional layers of protection through misdirection that would focus enemy attention on the wrong target. The psychological pressures that this arrangement placed on Peter Pettigrew revealed character weaknesses that had been concealed during peacetime, but became fatal flaws when tested by circumstances that demanded moral courage beyond his natural capacity. His transformation from loyal friend into betrayer was gradual rather than sudden, beginning with small compromises and rationalizations that made larger betrayals seem inevitable rather than chosen, until he found himself trapped in a web of deception and cowardice that offered no escape except through completing the treachery he had begun. The intelligence networks that Death Eaters used to track Order members and their families during this period demonstrated capabilities that suggested either magical techniques beyond normal wizarding knowledge or infiltration, so comprehensive that resistance activities were being monitored in real time by enemies who understood their opponent's psychology better than the resistors understood themselves. The precision with which families were targeted and the timing of attacks suggested advanced knowledge that could only have come from sources within the resistance movement itself. But the most troubling aspect of these targeting decisions was their apparent randomness, as families with minimal order connections found themselves attacked, while more prominent resistance figures remained untouched, creating patterns that suggested either deliberate misdirection designed to conceal the true source of intelligence, or strategic considerations that operated according to logic that conventional analysis could not penetrate. The psychological impact of this uncertainty was devastating for Order morale, as members began to suspect each other of providing information to enemies who seemed to possess supernatural awareness of their most carefully concealed activities. The prophecy's influence on Voldemort's strategic thinking extended beyond immediate targeting decisions to encompass broader questions about the nature of magical power, and the possibility that his approach to achieving immortality might have created unexpected vulnerabilities that prophetic intervention could exploit. His research into the specific wording of Trelawney's prediction revealed layers of meaning that suggested the confrontation would involve forces beyond conventional magical combat, requiring preparation that went beyond tactical planning to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of life, death, and the power that connected them. The power the Dark Lord knows not became an obsession that drove him to investigate magical phenomena that he had previously dismissed as irrelevant to his practical concerns, exploring obscure branches of magical theory that dealt with emotions and relationships, rather than the purely technical approaches that had characterized his previous research. The possibility that love, sacrifice, or other forms of human connection might possess magical properties that could threaten his carefully constructed immortality challenged assumptions that formed the foundation of his entire worldview. But his investigations into these phenomena were hampered by fundamental limitations in his own nature, as someone who had systematically destroyed his capacity for normal human emotion could not truly understand the forces he was attempting to analyze and counter. His approach to studying love and sacrifice was necessarily academic rather than experiential. Like a blind person, attempting to understand color through mathematical descriptions rather than direct perception, creating gaps in his knowledge that would prove crucial when the prophetic confrontation finally occurred. The increased security measures that both targeted families implemented during this period created new forms of isolation and psychological stress that affected children who were too young to understand why their lives had become so restricted and dangerous. Harry Potter's early months were spent in environments where every visitor was viewed with suspicion and every sound might signal the beginning of an attack, creating developmental conditions that would influence his psychological formation in ways that no one could predict or control. The weight of prophetic destiny began to influence the behavior of adults around these children in subtle but significant ways, as parents and protectors struggled with the knowledge that they were caring for individuals whose fates had been determined by forces beyond human understanding or influence. The simple pleasures of childhood became complicated by awareness that every day of innocence might be the last, While normal developmental milestones were overshadowed by preparation for confrontations that would determine the future of magical civilization itself. The prophecy had been revealed, the targeting decisions had been made, and the final preparations for confrontation were underway as the year 1980 drew toward its close. The forces of destiny were converging toward a Halloween night that would transform prophecy into reality, while revealing powers that the Dark Lord truly did not know, changing forever the nature of the conflict between good and evil in ways that no one could fully anticipate or understand. The decision to enter hiding under the protection of the Fidelius charm was not made lightly by James and Lily Potter, as it represented the abandonment of everything that had defined their lives since leaving Hogwarts, their work with the Order of the Phoenix, their connections to the broader magical community, and their ability to contribute meaningfully to the resistance against Voldemort's expanding reign of terror. The autumn of 1980 had brought intelligence so specific and terrifying that even Dumbledore's reassurances could not diminish the reality that their infant son had become the primary target of the most dangerous wizard in centuries. The cottage at Godric's Hollow had been chosen not for its comfort or convenience, but for its symbolic significance and the layers of ancient protective magic that had accumulated over generations of occupation by families who understood the importance of safeguarding their homes against dark forces. The village itself carried historical weight that appealed to James's sense of connection to magical heritage, while the cottage's modest appearance and unremarkable location provided the kind of anonymity that more ostentatious pureblood estates could never offer. But beneath these practical considerations lay deeper currents of meaning that influenced their choice in ways they might not have fully acknowledged even to themselves. Godric's Hollow was the birthplace of Godric Gryffindor himself, carrying associations with courage and noble sacrifice that resonated with their understanding of the role that destiny had assigned to their family. If Harry was indeed the child of prophecy, then raising him in a place sacred to the founder of Gryffindor House seemed fitting preparation for the confrontation that would inevitably come. The implementation of the Fidelius charm required magical expertise that pushed the boundaries of what even accomplished wizards could achieve safely, as the spell demanded not just technical precision but emotional commitment from all participants that went far beyond normal friendship or professional obligation. The magic literally required the secret keeper to become the repository for the protected family's very existence, holding their location, not just as information but as a fundamental aspect of reality that would cease to exist if the keeper's loyalty was compromised or destroyed. Dumbledore's offer to serve as their secret keeper was both generous and strategically sound, as his magical abilities and moral reputation provided assurances that few other individuals could match, while his prominence as Voldemort's primary opponent made him a target whose protection would receive the highest priority from Order resources and Ministry security measures. But James and Lily's decision to decline this offer reflected their understanding that Dumbledore's many responsibilities and public visibility made him vulnerable to forms of pressure and manipulation that might not affect someone with fewer obligations and a lower profile. Sirius Black's eager acceptance of the secret keeper role seemed natural and appropriate, given his status as James's closest friend and his proven commitment to protecting Harry from the moment of his birth. But the decision to make a last-minute change to Peter Pettigrew was motivated by tactical considerations that seemed logical despite the personal risks involved. The strategy was based on misdirection. Death Eaters would naturally assume that James would choose his most obvious friend as secret keeper, making Sirius the primary target for capture and interrogation, while leaving the actual keeper free to maintain the charm's protection. But this apparently clever deception contained a fatal flaw that reflected the conspirators' incomplete understanding of human psychology under extreme pressure and their overestimation of Peter Pettigrew's capacity for moral courage when faced with choices between personal survival and loyalty to friends who had trusted him with their lives. The very qualities that made him seem like an unlikely choice for Secret Keeper. His tendency to avoid confrontation, his preference for following rather than leading, his need for approval from stronger personalities, also made him vulnerable to forms of coercion and manipulation that more confident individuals might have resisted successfully. The psychological transformation that turned Peter from loyal friend into potential betrayer was gradual and initially almost imperceptible, beginning with small moments of doubt and self-preservation instinct that seemed natural and harmless, but created mental pathways that could be exploited by more systematic pressure. His knowledge that he held the Potter family's lives in his hands created anxiety that was compounded by his growing awareness of his own limitations and the terrible consequences that would follow if his resolve failed at the crucial moment. The Death Eater approach to recruiting Peter as an asset was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation that combined direct threats with appeals to his deepest insecurities and desires for security and belonging that his current situation could not satisfy. Rather than attempting crude intimidation that might have strengthened his resolve through righteous anger, they presented betrayal as the logical response to an impossible situation that offered no realistic hope for survival through continued resistance to inevitable Death Eater victory. The process began with seemingly accidental encounters that allowed Death Eater agents to assess Peter's psychological state and identify the specific fears and weaknesses that could be exploited most effectively, while gradually introducing ideas that made betrayal seem reasonable rather than treacherous. He was encouraged to consider his own survival needs and his obligations to preserve himself for future service to causes larger than individual loyalty, creating intellectual frameworks that transformed self-interest from vice into virtue through careful reframing of moral categories. The intelligence that Peter provided during the early stages of his recruitment was relatively minor. Information about order meeting locations that had already been changed, details about security procedures that were already known to Death Eater infiltrators, intelligence that seemed valuable to his new masters, while not immediately endangering the friends whose trust he was systematically betraying. But each small betrayal made larger ones easier to rationalize, creating a psychological descent that followed predictable patterns of moral compromise and self-justification. The most insidious aspect of this recruitment process was the way it convinced Peter that he was actually protecting James, Lily, and Harry by providing Death Eaters with information that would eventually lead to their capture, as his handlers promised that cooperation would result in merciful treatment rather than the torture and murder that would inevitably follow continued resistance. This narrative allowed him to maintain his self-image as a caring friend while simultaneously providing the intelligence that would make his friend's destruction possible. The life that James and Lily built within the protection of the Fidelius charm was simultaneously the most secure and most isolated existence they had ever experienced, as the spell's effectiveness depended on their complete withdrawal from all normal social connections and activities that might create patterns that observant enemies could detect and exploit. Their cottage became both sanctuary and prison, offering absolute protection from direct attack while cutting them off from the broader magical community whose fate their son was destined to determine. The daily routines that they established during these months of hiding reflected their attempts to create normalcy for Harry's development while maintaining the constant vigilance that their situation required, balancing the needs of a growing infant with security protocols that had been designed for military operations rather than family life. Every visitor had to be verified through multiple channels. Every delivery required careful inspection for concealed threats, and every moment of apparent calm carried the underlying tension of people who understood that their safety depended entirely on the continued loyalty of someone whose reliability they could never completely verify. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of their confinement was the psychological impact of knowing that their isolation was not temporary hardship, but potentially permanent exile from the world they had known, as the prophecy suggested that their current situation would continue until Harry was old enough to face his destiny in direct confrontation with Voldemort himself. The prospect of spending the next 15 or 20 years in hiding, watching their son grow up in an environment defined entirely by fear and secrecy, created emotional burdens that no amount of magical protection could alleviate. James's frustration with his enforced passivity was particularly acute. As someone whose entire adult identity had been built around active resistance to Death Eater expansion, found himself reduced to helpless observer of a conflict whose outcome would determine everything he valued most deeply. The Order missions he had previously led were continuing without him. Friends and colleagues were facing dangers that his experience might help them survive, and the broader struggle against Voldemort's forces was proceeding according to plans that no longer included his input or participation. Lily's adaptation to their new circumstances was complicated by her role as Harry's primary caregiver during a period when his development was being shaped by conditions that no child should have to experience, however necessary they might be for his physical survival. Her attempts to provide him with normal childhood experiences were constantly constrained by security requirements that made even simple activities like playing in the garden potentially dangerous. If they created patterns that observant enemies might detect and analyze. The magical protections that surrounded their cottage were layered so thickly that the very air seemed to shimmer with defensive energy, creating an environment where every breath carried reminders of the dangers that waited beyond their concealed boundaries. Ward schemes that had been developed specifically for their situation combined traditional, protective magic with innovations that pushed the boundaries of what individual wizards could accomplish through sustained effort and careful coordination with external support systems. But the most powerful protection surrounding Harry was not magical but emotional. The absolute devotion of parents who had consciously chosen to sacrifice everything else in their lives to ensure his safety and normal development, despite circumstances that made normality almost impossible to achieve. Their love for him was not sentimental, but fiercely practical, expressed through daily decisions that prioritized his well-being over their own comfort and long-term happiness. The intelligence reports that reached them through carefully maintained Order connections painted an increasingly grim picture of the war's progression, with Death Eater victories mounting while resistance capabilities diminished through attrition and the systematic targeting of experienced operatives whose loss could not be quickly replaced. Friends and colleagues were disappearing with alarming frequency, either killed in action or captured for interrogation that would reveal information about operations and personnel that could compromise additional lives. The Longbottom family's parallel experience under similar protection provided both reassurance and additional cause for concern, as their successful concealment proved that the Fidelius charm could indeed provide effective security, while their similar circumstances confirmed that Voldemort was indeed pursuing multiple potential targets rather than focusing exclusively on Harry. The coordination required for protecting both families simultaneously strained Order resources while creating additional opportunities for security breaches that might affect everyone involved in the extended protection effort. But the most troubling intelligence concerned Peter Pettigrew's behavior during Order meetings and operations, as several members had begun reporting subtle changes in his demeanor and decision-making that suggested either psychological stress beyond normal wartime anxiety, or compromise that he was attempting to conceal through increasingly elaborate deception. His questions about security procedures seemed too detailed for legitimate curiosity, while his knowledge of operational details that he should not have possessed suggested either exceptional intelligence gathering skills or access to information sources that had not been disclosed to his colleagues. Sirius Black's growing suspicions about Peter's reliability created a crisis of confidence that threatened the entire protection scheme, as questioning the Secret Keeper's loyalty meant questioning the fundamental assumptions on which their security depended, while potentially alerting enemies to information about their protective measures that could be used to develop countermeasures. The circular nature of this problem made resolution almost impossible. Investigating Peter's loyalty required sharing information that could compromise everyone's security if the suspicions proved accurate. The attempts to verify Peter's continued reliability through indirect observation and careful questioning revealed behavior patterns that were ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations, as his obvious anxiety and defensive responses could indicate either guilty knowledge of betrayal or legitimate stress about the enormous responsibility he had accepted on behalf of friends whose lives depended on his continued discretion. The psychological pressure of carrying such responsibility would be enough to change anyone's behavior in ways that might seem suspicious to observers who were themselves under similar stress. The gradual deterioration of communication security during the final months before the October attack reflected the cumulative impact of Death Eater operations against Order infrastructure and personnel, making even the most careful attempts at coordination vulnerable to interception and analysis by enemies who had devoted enormous resources to breaking resistance communication systems. The magical techniques that had previously provided secure channels were proving inadequate against opponents who understood the underlying principles well enough to develop effective countermeasures. But beyond technical vulnerabilities, the communication problems reflected deeper issues of trust and confidence that affected every aspect of Order operations. As members began to suspect each other of providing information to enemies whose knowledge of their activities seemed to exceed what conventional intelligence gathering could explain, the paranoia that resulted from these suspicions was both justified by legitimate security concerns and counterproductive in its impact on operational effectiveness and group morale. The final weeks before the Halloween attack were marked by an increase in Death Eater activity throughout Britain that suggested major operations were being planned, though the specific targets and timing remained unclear, despite intensive intelligence gathering efforts by Order operatives and Ministry security forces. The pattern of preliminary attacks and reconnaissance activities indicated coordination on a scale that exceeded anything previously observed, while the geographic distribution suggested either multiple simultaneous objectives or elaborate misdirection designed to conceal the true focus of enemy planning. James and Lily's growing sense of isolation during this period was compounded by their awareness that the intelligence reaching them through Order channels was becoming increasingly unreliable and incomplete, leaving them to guess about developments that might directly affect their security while remaining unable to take any action that might improve their situation or protect their friends who were still actively engaged in the conflict. The helplessness of their position was psychologically devastating for people who had previously defined themselves through active resistance to injustice and oppression. The last communication they received from Order headquarters came on October 28th and contained warnings about increased Death Eater activity in their general area, along with instructions to maintain absolute concealment until the current crisis passed. But the vague nature of these warnings and the absence of specific threat information left them uncertain about whether they were facing imminent danger or simply dealing with the elevated baseline of risk that had characterized their entire period in hiding. The final 3 days before the attack passed with agonizing slowness, as every sound outside their cottage seemed potentially significant, and every moment of apparent calm felt like the prelude to violence that might begin without warning, or opportunity for effective response. Their magical defenses were tested and retested. Their emergency procedures were reviewed obsessively, and their preparations for protecting Harry were rehearsed until they became automatic responses that could be executed even under conditions of extreme stress and confusion. But beneath all these practical preparations lay the terrible knowledge that their protection ultimately depended not on magical defenses or tactical planning, but on the continued loyalty of someone whose reliability they could never completely verify, and whose psychological state they could not monitor or influence. Peter Pettigrew held their lives in his hands through a trust that had been given freely, but could not be withdrawn without destroying the very protection that made their survival possible. The irony of their situation was complete and tragic. The friendship that had originally motivated their trust in Peter was now the weakness that made betrayal possible, while the very secrecy that protected them from Death Eater attack also prevented them from taking the precautions that might have saved their lives. If they had known that their secret keeper had already chosen to serve their enemies rather than preserve their safety, the Fidelius charm that represented their greatest protection had become the mechanism of their ultimate vulnerability, creating the perfect conditions for a betrayal that would transform prophecy into reality while revealing powers that the Dark Lord truly did not know. The night of October 31st, 1981, began with the kind of deceptive calm that had learned to mask the most terrible events, as if the very darkness itself conspired to conceal the approaching convergence of prophecy and betrayal that would reshape the wizarding world forever. In the cottage at Godric's Hollow, James and Lily Potter followed the evening routines that had become second nature during their months of protective isolation, unaware that their secret keeper had already provided their enemies with the information needed to transform their sanctuary into a trap from which no amount of magical skill or parental love could provide escape. The intelligence that Peter Pettigrew had finally surrendered to his Death Eater handlers was comprehensive and devastating, including not just the location protected by the Fidelius charm, but detailed information about the cottage's defensive arrangements, the family's daily schedules, and the specific magical techniques they would likely employ if their concealment was compromised. His betrayal was methodical and complete, motivated not by sudden crisis of conscience, but by months of gradual moral erosion that had transformed him from protector into accomplice in what he knew would be the murder of his closest friends and their infant son. Lord Voldemort's preparation for this confrontation reflected his understanding that the prophetic child represented a threat unlike any he had previously faced, requiring not just overwhelming magical force but tactical approach that would prevent any possibility of escape or intervention by allies who might attempt to interfere with destiny's unfolding. His selection of Halloween night was deliberately symbolic, choosing a time when the boundaries between life and death were traditionally understood to be at their thinnest, creating atmospheric conditions that would enhance the dark magic he intended to employ, while sending a message about the fate awaiting anyone who dared to oppose his will. The Dark Lord's physical approach to Godric's Hollow was conducted with the kind of methodical patience that characterized his most important operations, as he understood that haste or carelessness during this crucial mission might provide his prophetic enemy with opportunities for escape or resistance that could transform certain victory into catastrophic failure. His route through the village was planned to avoid detection by the few remaining residents who had not fled the increasingly dangerous conditions that characterized most magical communities during this period of the war. The cottage itself appeared exactly as Peter's intelligence had described. Its modest exterior, concealing the layers of protective magic that had been woven around the Potter family during their months of hiding, But these defenses were designed to repel conventional attacks rather than the specific techniques that Voldemort had developed for breaching protections that their creators had believed to be impregnable. The Fidelius charm that had hidden the building's existence was now working in his favor, preventing any casual observers from witnessing the events that were about to unfold within its concealed boundaries. Inside the cottage, James and Lily were sharing what would prove to be their final evening together as a family, with Harry playing contentedly among toys that had been charmed to provide entertainment while remaining completely silent to avoid attracting unwanted attention from potential enemies who might be conducting surveillance in the area. Their conversation was relaxed in the way that had become possible only during the past few months, as the constant stress of their situation had gradually given way to acceptance of their circumstances and focus on creating whatever normalcy was possible within the constraints of their protective isolation. The first indication that their security had been compromised came not from their magical detection systems, which had been designed to identify conventional approaches by hostile forces, but from the sudden failure of protective wards that had been functioning perfectly for months without requiring maintenance or adjustment. The systematic collapse of their defensive magic was too coordinated to represent random failure and too comprehensive to indicate anything other than deliberate sabotage by someone with intimate knowledge of how their protections had been constructed and maintained. James's response to these warning signs was immediate and professionally competent, as his Auror training and Order experience had prepared him for exactly this type of emergency, even though the theoretical knowledge felt entirely different when applied to protecting his own family rather than strangers whose safety was his professional responsibility. His attempts to activate emergency communication protocols and summon assistance from Order allies revealed the extent to which their isolation had made them vulnerable, as the same concealment magic that protected them from enemy detection also prevented them from calling for help when that protection was finally breached. The sound of the front door exploding inward under the impact of magic, more powerful than anything the cottage's defenses had been designed to withstand, announced Voldemort's arrival with theatrical drama that was entirely intentional, designed to create maximum psychological impact while demonstrating the futility of resistance against someone whose capabilities exceeded anything that conventional magical education or training could provide. The Dark Lord entered the Potter home like a force of nature given human form, his presence radiating malevolent energy that made the very air seem thick and poisonous to breathe. James's confrontation with Voldemort in the cottage's main room was brief, but demonstrated the courage that had made him legendary within Order circles and earned him recognition as one of the most formidable opponents that Death Eater forces had encountered during nearly a decade of escalating conflict. His tactical skills and magical abilities were considerable, refined through years of dangerous operations and life or death situations that had taught him to fight with the kind of desperate efficiency that characterized only the most experienced combat wizards. But the disparity in power between the two combatants was so enormous that skill and experience could not compensate for the fundamental differences in their magical capabilities, as Voldemort's Horcrux-enhanced abilities and decades of research into the darkest forms of magic made him effectively invincible against opponents who remained bound by human limitations and moral constraints that he had abandoned long ago. The duel, if it could be called that, lasted less than 2 minutes before ending with the green flash of the killing curse that struck James down instantly and without possibility of recovery or resurrection. Lily's desperate attempt to protect Harry in the cottage's upstairs nursery represented the kind of maternal instinct that transcended rational calculation and tactical planning, as she positioned herself between her son and an enemy whose power she understood perfectly, but whom she was willing to face rather than abandon the child whose life had given meaning and purpose to everything she had accomplished since leaving Hogwarts. Her knowledge that resistance was hopeless did not diminish her determination to make Voldemort's victory as difficult and costly as possible. Understanding that even futile gestures might somehow contribute to the larger struggle between good and evil that would continue long after her own death. The Dark Lord's offer to spare her life, if she stepped aside and allowed him to complete his mission, revealed both his tactical pragmatism and his fundamental inability to understand the forces that motivated people whose loyalty transcended self-preservation and personal advancement. His surprise at her refusal to accept survival at the cost of her son's life demonstrated the psychological blindness that accompanied his transformation from human being into something that existed beyond normal moral categories, creating vulnerabilities that he could not recognize because he lacked the emotional capacity necessary for understanding them. Lily's final words to Voldemort were not pleas for mercy or attempts at negotiation, but simple declarations of the love that had shaped every decision she had made since Harry's birth, creating magical conditions that the Dark Lord's extensive research had never anticipated, because his investigation of protective magic had focused on technical mechanisms rather than the emotional foundations that gave such spells their ultimate power. Her willing sacrifice in defense of her son activated ancient magic that operated according to principles that predated formal magical education and institutional knowledge, drawing upon forces that existed at the very heart of what made magic possible in the first place. The killing curse that ended Lily's life was cast with the same casual efficiency that had characterized Voldemort's murder of James, but the magical conditions surrounding her death were fundamentally different from anything the Dark Lord had previously encountered, as her sacrifice had transformed the cottage's atmosphere in ways that his enhanced senses could detect but not interpret or understand. The protective magic that her death had invoked was not visible or audible in any conventional sense, but it was present and growing stronger with each second that passed between her murder and his intended killing of the child she had died to protect. Harry Potter's reaction to his mother's death and Voldemort's looming presence was exactly what might be expected from a 15-month-old infant confronting circumstances far beyond his ability to comprehend or influence, but his apparent helplessness concealed magical protections that had been activated by Lily's sacrifice and were now operating according to laws that no living wizard fully understood. The power that the Dark Lord knew not was not located in Harry himself, but in the magical conditions that surrounded him, created by love and sacrifice that had transformed the very nature of reality within the cottage's walls. Voldemort's approach to the child was cautious despite his absolute confidence in the outcome, as his enhanced magical senses were detecting anomalies in the cottage's magical atmosphere that suggested the presence of forces that his extensive knowledge could not identify or categorize. But his interpretation of these phenomena was filtered through assumptions about magical power that prevented him from recognizing the true nature of what he was encountering, leading him to attribute the strange sensations to residual effects of the protective wards he had already destroyed, rather than to new forms of magic that his actions had inadvertently created. The killing curse that he directed toward Harry Potter was cast with the full power of someone who had mastered death itself through Horcrux creation and decades of research into the darkest aspects of magical theory, representing the culmination of everything he had learned about the destruction of life and the assertion of will over the fundamental forces that governed existence. The green light that erupted from his wand carried enough magical energy to kill dozens of ordinary wizards simultaneously, its intensity reflecting not just his determination to complete the prophetic confrontation, but his unconscious awareness that this moment would determine the ultimate trajectory of his carefully constructed immortality. But the ancient magic that Lily's sacrifice had invoked operated according to principles that Voldemort's technical knowledge could not counter, because it existed at levels of reality that his artificial approach to transcending human limitations had never touched or understood. The protective power that surrounded Harry was not a spell that could be dispelled or a charm that could be overwhelmed through superior force, but a fundamental alteration in the magical laws that governed the space around the child, creating conditions where love was literally stronger than death, and sacrifice could redirect even the most powerful, destructive magic back upon its source. The rebounding of the killing curse struck Voldemort with the full force of his own magical power, enhanced by the protective energies that Lily's death had released, creating a feedback effect that his Horcrux-damaged soul could not absorb or deflect without suffering catastrophic trauma that threatened the very foundations of his artificially extended existence. The pain that accompanied this magical backlash was unlike anything he had experienced since beginning his transformation from Tom Riddle into something that existed beyond human limitation, suggesting that the protective magic was attacking not just his physical form, but the metaphysical structures that made his immortality possible. The destruction of Voldemort's body was instantaneous and complete, reducing the most feared wizard in centuries to nothing more than a wisp of consciousness that fled the cottage carrying only the barest essence of what he had become, leaving behind no physical remains that could be analyzed or studied by those who would eventually attempt to understand what had occurred during those crucial moments in the nursery. His survival in this diminished form was possible only because of the Horcruxes that anchored his soul to the mortal world, but even these artifacts could not prevent the catastrophic damage that the rebounding curse had inflicted on his ability to maintain physical existence. The cottage itself bore the scars of magical forces that exceeded anything in recorded wizarding history, with walls cracked and furniture destroyed by energies that operated beyond normal categories of spell damage or curse effects, while the nursery where the confrontation had occurred was left permanently altered by magic that would never fully dissipate or return to normal background levels. The physical evidence of what had transpired would provide researchers with material for decades of study, though their investigations would never fully explain the mechanisms that had made such an outcome possible. Harry Potter's survival of the killing curse was unprecedented in magical history and created a living mystery that would influence the trajectory of wizarding society for generations to come, as his existence proved that even the most fundamental certainties about magical law were subject to exceptions that occurred under conditions that no one fully understood. The lightning bolt scar that the encounter had left on his forehead carried magical properties that connected him permanently to the Dark Lord who had tried to kill him, creating a bond that would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate aftermath of that Halloween night. But the most profound transformation wrought by the events at Godric's Hollow was not physical but spiritual, as the cottage had become the site where love had proven stronger than hate, where sacrifice had overcome selfishness, and where the power of human connection had defeated the ultimate expression of magical tyranny and oppression. The victory was not Harry's achievement, but Lily's legacy, purchased with her life, but extending its protection to encompass not just her son, but the entire wizarding world that would benefit from Voldemort's temporary defeat. The magical explosion that accompanied Voldemort's destruction was visible throughout the village and beyond, creating a pillar of light that rose into the Halloween sky like a beacon announcing the end of the most terrible period in modern wizarding history. Though few witnesses understood the significance of what they were observing or realized that they were witnessing the fulfillment of prophecy and the triumph of forces that existed beyond the normal boundaries of magical knowledge and understanding. In the ruins of the nursery, Harry Potter lay sleeping peacefully among the debris of the confrontation that had made him the most famous child in the wizarding world, his survival representing not just personal victory, but proof that the values his parents had died to defend were worth any sacrifice that their preservation might require. The infant who had somehow survived the killing curse would grow up carrying the hopes and fears of an entire civilization. But for now, he was simply a baby who had lost his parents but gained a destiny that would shape the future of magical society in ways that no prophecy could fully predict or contain. The night that had begun with betrayal and family dinner had ended with the most significant transformation in magical history, as the power the Dark Lord knew not had revealed itself through the oldest and most fundamental force in the universe, the love of a mother for her child, willing to sacrifice everything to ensure his survival and create the conditions that would eventually allow good to triumph over evil through means that no amount of technical knowledge or magical power could anticipate or prevent. The dawn that followed Voldemort's destruction brought with it a euphoria that swept through the wizarding world like wildfire, as news of the Dark Lord's defeat spread through communities that had lived in terror for more than a decade. But beneath the celebrations lay the complex and often brutal reality of determining justice for those who had served evil, while distinguishing between the genuinely repentant and the merely opportunistic. The Ministry of Magic, which had been weakened and compromised throughout the conflict, now faced the monumental task of rebuilding legitimate government, while simultaneously hunting down Death Eaters who had scattered like leaves before winter wind when their master's power was broken. The immediate priority was securing those Death Eaters who had been identified during the war, but had managed to avoid capture through political connections, superior resources, or simple luck that had allowed them to remain at liberty while their victims suffered and died. The Auror Office, depleted by years of casualties and infiltration, was suddenly tasked with apprehending criminals whose magical abilities and tactical knowledge made them extraordinarily dangerous, even without Voldemort's direct leadership, to coordinate their activities and provide them with strategic direction. Mad-Eye Moody's coordination of these capture operations reflected both his legendary skills and his understanding that the window of opportunity for apprehending Death Eaters would close rapidly as former followers realized their vulnerability and took steps to conceal their involvement or flee to countries where British magical law could not reach them. His tactics were necessarily harsh, as conventional law enforcement methods had proven inadequate against opponents who acknowledged no moral boundaries and possessed magical capabilities that exceeded those of ordinary criminals by orders of magnitude. The arrest of Bellatrix Lestrange, Rodolphus Lestrange, Rabastan Lestrange, and Barty Crouch Jr. represented both a triumph of investigative persistence and a tragedy that revealed the depths of depravity to which Voldemort's most devoted followers had descended during their service to his cause. These four had been discovered in the act of torturing Frank and Alice Longbottom with the Cruciatus Curse, seeking information about their master's whereabouts, and refusing to accept that his defeat was genuine rather than temporary setback that would be followed by his inevitable return to power. The condition in which the Longbottoms were found shocked even experienced Aurors who had witnessed the worst atrocities of the war, as the systematic application of the torture curse had destroyed their minds so completely that they would never recover their sanity or ability to function as independent human beings. The couple who had been among the Order's most capable operatives were reduced to shells of their former selves, unable to recognize their own son or remember their names, while their bodies remained physically intact but housed minds that had been shattered beyond any possibility of magical or medical repair. The trial of the Lestranges and Crouch became the most significant legal proceeding in modern wizarding history, serving both as an attempt to achieve justice for specific victims and as a broader examination of the moral and legal questions raised by Death Eater activities during the war. The evidence presented was comprehensive and damning, including not just the circumstances of their capture, but detailed documentation of their involvement in murders, tortures, and other atrocities that had terrorized magical Britain for more than a decade. Bellatrix Lestrange's behavior during the proceedings revealed the psychological transformation that prolonged service to Voldemort had wrought upon his most devoted followers, as she showed no remorse for her actions, while continuing to express fanatical loyalty to a master whose defeat she refused to acknowledge as permanent. Her courtroom declarations that the Dark Lord would return to reward his faithful servants and punish those who had opposed him were delivered with conviction that suggested either complete delusion or knowledge about Voldemort's survival that she was unwilling to reveal even under the threat of life imprisonment in Azkaban. The sentences handed down in these cases reflected the wizarding legal system's struggle to find punishments adequate for crimes that exceeded anything in their historical precedent, while also serving the broader political purpose of demonstrating that the post-war order would not tolerate the kind of impunity that Death Eaters had enjoyed during Voldemort's reign. Life imprisonment in Azkaban was the harshest penalty available under wizarding law, though many observers questioned whether any punishment could truly balance the scales of justice for people who had committed atrocities with such systematic thoroughness and apparent enjoyment. But even as these high-profile convictions proceeded, the broader campaign to identify and prosecute Death Eaters revealed the inadequacy of the wizarding legal system when confronted with the scope of collaboration and complicity that Voldemort's movement had achieved throughout magical society. The number of individuals who had provided support, information, or services to Death Eater operations far exceeded the capacity of the courts to process, while the evidence required for conviction was often difficult to obtain given the secretive nature of the organization and the deaths of many potential witnesses during the conflict. Igor Karkaroff's decision to cooperate with ministry investigators in exchange for reduced punishment created both opportunities and complications for the post-war justice process, as his intimate knowledge of Death Eater operations and personnel could facilitate additional arrests, while his obvious self-interest in providing information raised questions about the reliability and completeness of his testimony. His courtroom appearances became theatrical performances, where he attempted to demonstrate his value as an informant, while minimizing his own culpability for crimes that he described as the inevitable result of coercion rather than voluntary choice. The list of names that Karkaroff provided to the court included both expected suspects and shocking revelations about individuals whose involvement in Death Eater activities had never been suspected by their colleagues, friends, or family members. Some of these accusations led to additional investigations and arrests, while others were dismissed as attempts by Karkaroff to deflect attention from his own guilt by implicating people who had been his personal enemies rather than genuine Death Eater collaborators. The case of Severus Snape represented perhaps the most complex and controversial aspect of the entire post-war justice process, as his obvious involvement in Death Eater activities was balanced against Dumbledore's insistence that he had been working as a double agent whose intelligence had been crucial for order operations, and whose continued liberty was essential for reasons that could not be disclosed publicly. The headmaster's testimony on Snape's behalf carried enormous weight given his reputation for moral integrity and his leadership role in the resistance against Voldemort. But it also raised troubling questions about the extent to which pragmatic considerations should override legal justice in the aftermath of such extensive criminality. The decision to grant Snape immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony about Death Eater activities and his continued service to the rebuilding magical community was deeply unpopular among many war survivors who had lost family members to Death Eater attacks, but it reflected the complex reality that defeating evil often required alliances with people whose own moral record was questionable. The precedent established by his case would influence similar decisions about other individuals whose wartime activities fell into grey areas between clear collaboration and obvious resistance. Lucius Malfoy's escape from serious legal consequences, despite overwhelming evidence of his Death Eater involvement, demonstrated the continued influence of wealth and political connections in a legal system that had been corrupted by years of war and institutional breakdown. His claims that all his apparent collaboration had been the result of imperious curse compulsion were transparently false to anyone with genuine knowledge of Death Eater operations. But proving voluntary participation required evidence that was difficult to obtain given the organization's secretive nature and the deaths of many potential witnesses. The Malfoy family's ability to avoid justice while lesser figures faced imprisonment or execution revealed fundamental inequalities in the post-war settlement that would create lasting resentment among those who had suffered under Death Eater oppression while watching their tormentors purchase freedom through political influence and financial resources. The message sent by such outcomes was profoundly demoralizing to people who had expected that Voldemort's defeat would usher in an era of genuine justice rather than simply a return to the status quo that had allowed such evil to flourish in the first place. Similar patterns of selective justice characterized the treatment of other wealthy, pure-blood families whose Death Eater connections were well documented, but whose social position and financial resources provided them with legal advantages that ordinary criminals could never access. The Crabbe, Goyle, and Knott families all managed to avoid serious consequences through combinations of claimed coercion, destroyed evidence, and expensive legal representation that ordinary wizards could not afford. The systematic failure to achieve comprehensive justice for Death Eater crimes created a foundation of unresolved grievance and institutional illegitimacy that would influence wizarding politics for decades to come, as the message sent by these outcomes was that wealth and social position could provide immunity from consequences even for the most serious crimes. The survivors of Death Eater attacks and the families of those who had been murdered during the war were forced to watch as their victimizers returned to positions of influence and respectability without having paid meaningful prices for their participation in systematic terrorism and genocide. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of the post-war justice process was the treatment of individuals who had been genuinely coerced into Death Eater service through imperious curse compulsion or threats to their families, as the legal system proved incapable of distinguishing reliably between voluntary collaboration and actual victimization. The burden of proof required for establishing genuine coercion was so high that many legitimate victims found themselves prosecuted alongside willing collaborators, while sophisticated criminals who had participated enthusiastically in Death Eater operations managed to escape consequences by claiming compulsion that they had never actually experienced. The case of Peter Pettigrew represented a unique category within this complex landscape of post-war justice, as his betrayal of the Potter family made him directly responsible for the deaths of James and Lily, while simultaneously exposing him to Death Eater retaliation that would make his survival unlikely if he remained within their reach. His disappearance on the night of Voldemort's defeat was initially attributed to death during the magical explosion that destroyed his master, but subsequent investigation revealed evidence suggesting that he had survived and fled to avoid both legal prosecution and Death Eater revenge. The false accusation and imprisonment of Sirius Black represented perhaps the most egregious failure of the post-war justice system, as a combination of circumstantial evidence, public prejudice against his family background, and institutional pressure to produce quick convictions, led to his incarceration without trial for crimes that he had not only not committed, but had actively worked to prevent. His case became emblematic of the ways in which the pursuit of justice had been corrupted by the desire for vengeance and the need to satisfy public demands for accountability, regardless of actual guilt or innocence. The evidence that condemned Sirius was superficially compelling, but would not have withstood careful scrutiny had the legal system been functioning according to its normal standards, rather than the emergency procedures that had been implemented during and after the war. His role as the presumed secret keeper for the Potter family made him appear responsible for their deaths, while his presence at the scene of Peter Pettigrew's apparent death provided additional circumstantial support for the narrative that he had killed his former friend to prevent him from revealing information about Death Eater operations. The public's eagerness to believe in Sirius's guilt reflected both their need for simple explanations for complex tragedies and their unconscious prejudice against someone whose family name was associated with Death Eater ideology. Despite his personal rejection of those beliefs and his dedicated service to the Order of the Phoenix, the Black family's reputation for dark magic and pure blood supremacy made it psychologically easier for people to accept that Sirius had betrayed his friends than to acknowledge the more complex truth about Peter Pettigrew's moral failure and the inadequacy of their understanding about human nature under extreme pressure. The imprisonment of an innocent man, while the actual traitor escaped justice, became a symbol of the post-war period's broader failure to achieve the kind of moral reckoning that many had hoped would follow Voldemort's defeat, as institutional prejudice and procedural shortcuts had produced outcomes that perpetuated injustice rather than correcting it. Sirius's suffering in Azkaban prison would continue for more than a decade, serving as a constant reminder that the victory over Voldemort had not automatically created the just society that his defeat had seemed to promise. The treatment of families who had suffered under Death Eater persecution revealed additional inadequacies in the post-war settlement, as the psychological and financial support needed for recovery from systematic trauma was never adequately provided by institutions that were focused more on returning to normal operations than on addressing the lasting damage that years of conflict had inflicted on individuals and communities. The Longbottom's condition required specialized care that stretched the resources of Street Mungo's hospital beyond their capacity, while other victims found themselves struggling with disabilities and psychological wounds that the magical medical system was not equipped to treat effectively. The children who had been orphaned by Death Eater attacks faced particular challenges in a society that had been so thoroughly disrupted by war that normal support systems for vulnerable individuals had largely collapsed, while the foster care and adoption services that might have provided them with new families were overwhelmed by the number of cases requiring attention. Many of these children grew up in institutional settings that provided basic care but could not replace the family relationships that violence had destroyed, creating a generation whose development had been shaped by loss and abandonment rather than love and security. The economic consequences of Death Eater activities during the war had created widespread hardship that the post-war government was unable to address effectively, given its own institutional weakness and the enormous costs associated with rebuilding magical infrastructure that had been systematically destroyed or disrupted during the conflict. Businesses that had been targeted for destruction or extortion struggled to resume operations, while families whose breadwinners had been killed or incapacitated faced poverty that existing social safety nets were inadequate to address. The psychological trauma that affected virtually everyone who had lived through the war years manifested in ways that the magical medical system was unprepared to diagnose or treat, as conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder were poorly understood within magical medicine, and the stigma associated with mental health problems prevented many people from seeking the help they needed. The result was a society where large numbers of people were struggling with depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions that affected their ability to function normally while receiving little or no professional support for their difficulties. The educational system faced particular challenges in returning to normal operations after years of disruption, and the loss of many experienced teachers who had been killed or driven away by Death Eater persecution, while students who had missed significant portions of their magical education due to safety concerns or family displacement struggled to catch up with their peers who had been able to continue their studies under more stable conditions. The long-term consequences of these educational disruptions would affect an entire generation of witches and wizards whose knowledge and skills were incomplete compared to what previous generations had achieved. The international implications of the post-war justice process were equally complex, as Death Eater operations had extended beyond Britain's borders, while many of their supporters had fled to other countries where they might continue their activities, or simply live quietly while avoiding accountability for their wartime crimes. The lack of effective international cooperation in tracking down and extraditing these fugitives meant that many escaped justice entirely, while others were able to establish new lives in societies where their past activities were unknown or ignored. The failure to achieve comprehensive justice for Death Eater crimes created conditions that would allow Voldemort's ideology to survive his physical defeat, as former followers who had escaped accountability were able to maintain their beliefs and potentially pass them on to new generations, while the institutional and social changes necessary to prevent future resurgence of such movements were never fully implemented. The post-war settlement had restored peace but not justice, stability but not healing, creating a foundation for future conflicts that would eventually manifest when the Dark Lord found ways to return to physical form and resume his campaign of terror and oppression. The incomplete nature of post-war justice would haunt the wizarding world for decades to come, as the unresolved grievances and institutional failures that characterized this period would create vulnerabilities that Voldemort would eventually exploit when he returned to continue the war that his temporary defeat had interrupted but not ended. The celebration of victory had been premature, and the work of building a truly just society had been abandoned in favor of returning to familiar patterns that had allowed evil to flourish in the first place. The years that followed Voldemort's defeat were marked by a peculiar form of collective amnesia, as the wizarding world struggled to process the trauma of nearly 11 years of systematic terror, while simultaneously attempting to return to patterns of normalcy that had been shattered so completely that their restoration required constant effort and deliberate self-deception. The euphoria that had initially greeted news of the Dark Lord's destruction gradually gave way to a more complex emotional landscape, where relief was mixed with grief, celebration was tempered by loss, and hope was shadowed by the persistent fear that the peace they had achieved might prove as temporary as the previous periods of calm that had preceded earlier outbreaks of magical violence. The reconstruction of wizarding institutions proceeded with mechanical efficiency that masked deeper questions about whether the social and political structures that had allowed Voldemort's rise could be reformed sufficiently to prevent similar threats from emerging in the future, or whether fundamental changes would be required that the current leadership was neither willing nor able to implement effectively. The Ministry of Magic returned to its familiar routines of bureaucratic administration and regulatory oversight, but beneath the surface of restored normalcy lay unresolved tensions and institutional weaknesses that had been exposed rather than corrected by the war's conclusion. The decision to place Harry Potter with his Muggle relatives represented perhaps the most significant and controversial choice made during the immediate post-war period, as Dumbledore's insistence that the boy would be safest among people who had no connection to the magical world conflicted with the natural desire of many Order members to ensure that the child who had saved them all would be raised within a community that understood his significance and could provide him with the love and recognition that his heroism deserved. But Dumbledore's reasoning extended far beyond simple security considerations to encompass complex magical theories about the nature of the protection that Lily Potter's sacrifice had created around her son, protection that could only be maintained through blood relationships that connected Harry to his mother's family despite their complete rejection of the magical world and everything it represented. The ancient magic that had saved Harry's life required specific conditions to remain effective, conditions that could be met only through his residence with Petunia Dursley, despite her obvious unwillingness to welcome him into her home and her husband's active hostility toward anything connected to magical power. The Dursley household on Privet Drive represented everything that the wizarding world had traditionally viewed with mixture of condescension and incomprehension. The relentlessly ordinary Muggle existence that magical folk used as a baseline for measuring their own superiority and specialness. Vernon and Petunia Dursley embodied the kind of determined normality that defined itself through rejection of anything unusual, different, or potentially threatening to their carefully constructed sense of respectability and social position within their suburban community. Their treatment of Harry reflected not just personal resentment about the disruption his presence caused to their plans for a perfectly ordinary family life, but deeper prejudices about magical power and the people who possessed it that had been shaped by Petunia's childhood experiences with her sister Lily's abilities and her own exclusion from the magical world that had claimed her, siblings' attention and affection. The cruelty they showed toward their unwilling charge was systematic and deliberate, designed to suppress any signs of magical ability, while reinforcing their conviction that such powers were dangerous aberrations that needed to be controlled or eliminated entirely. But even as Harry Potter disappeared into the anonymous suburbs of Little Whinging, his legend continued to grow throughout the magical world, as the story of the infant who had somehow survived the killing curse became the foundation for a mythology that offered hope and inspiration to people who needed to believe that good could triumph over evil through means that transcended ordinary human capabilities. The details of what had actually occurred at Godric's Hollow remained largely secret, known only to a few individuals who understood the importance of preserving certain mysteries, rather than subjecting them to the kind of analysis that might diminish their power to inspire faith and courage. The celebration of Halloween as Harry Potter Day became an annual ritual that served multiple functions within post-war magical society, providing both an opportunity for communal expression of gratitude for deliverance from terror and a mechanism for processing collective trauma through shared commemoration of victory over forces that had seemed invincible until proven otherwise. But the holiday also carried darker undertones for those who understood the true costs of that victory, as the deaths of James and Lily Potter and countless others were remembered alongside the celebration of Voldemort's defeat. The cottage at Godric's Hollow was preserved as a memorial site that attracted pilgrims and tourists in roughly equal numbers, creating a shrine to martyrdom and sacrifice that served the psychological needs of people who required physical locations where they could pay respects to those who had died for their freedom. The building itself had been stabilized but not repaired, allowing visitors to see the actual damage caused by the magical forces that had been unleashed during that fateful Halloween night. While the nursery where Harry had survived remained exactly as it had been found, protected by preservation charms that would maintain its appearance indefinitely. But the most significant memorial to the war's conclusion was not physical but social. The gradual return of trust and normal interaction to magical communities that had been poisoned by years of suspicion and paranoia that had made ordinary relationships nearly impossible to maintain. The knowledge that anyone might be operating under imperious curse compulsion or serving as a voluntary Death Eater informant had created an atmosphere where even casual conversation carried risks that prudent people preferred to avoid, while family gatherings and social events had been abandoned as too dangerous given the possibility that attendees might include enemies in disguise. The restoration of social life proceeded slowly and unevenly, as people who had spent years assuming the worst about their neighbors and colleagues found it difficult to return to patterns of openness and casual interaction that had been appropriate during peacetime, but potentially fatal during the patterns. War years. Children who had grown up during the conflict required education in normal social behavior, having learned to regard strangers with suspicion and to avoid drawing attention to themselves or their families through behavior that might be interpreted as politically significant. The magical economy's recovery from wartime disruption was complicated by the systematic destruction of infrastructure and the loss of human capital that had characterized Death Eater strategy throughout the conflict, as businesses and institutions that had been targeted for elimination during the war required not just financial resources for rebuilding, but replacement of expertise and institutional knowledge that had been destroyed along with the people who possessed it. The shortage of experienced professionals in crucial areas like magical medicine, advanced transfiguration, and curse breaking created bottlenecks that slowed reconstruction efforts, while opening opportunities for less qualified individuals to assume responsibilities that they might not have been able to handle under normal competitive conditions. The wizarding educational system faced particular challenges in returning to pre-war standards of instruction and student achievement, as many potential teachers had been killed or had fled the country during the worst periods of the conflict, while students who had missed significant portions of their magical education due to safety concerns or family displacement struggled to catch up with their peers, who had been able to continue their studies under more stable conditions. The long-term consequences of these educational disruptions would affect an entire generation of witches and wizards whose knowledge and skills were incomplete compared to what previous generations had achieved. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry itself bore physical and psychological scars that would take decades to heal completely, as the castle had served as both target and symbol throughout the war years, while several of its professors had been killed or disappeared during Death Eater attacks on educational institutions. The return to normal academic routine required conscious effort from staff and students alike, as everyone involved had been changed by their experiences during the conflict and found it difficult to resume the innocent routines of teaching and learning that had been appropriate before the war transformed their understanding of what education meant and why it mattered. The international magical community's response to British Wizarding Society's reconstruction efforts was complicated by their own experiences during the war years, as many foreign magical governments had maintained official neutrality, while privately sympathizing with one side or the other based on their own political considerations and cultural values. The isolation that Britain had experienced during the worst periods of the conflict had created resentments and suspicions that influenced post-war diplomatic relationships. While the success of British resistance efforts had generated both admiration and concern about the methods that had been employed to achieve victory over such formidable enemies, the refugees and exiles who had fled Britain during the war years faced complex decisions about whether to return to homeland that had been transformed by their absence and might not welcome their homecoming, particularly if their departure had been seen as abandonment by those who had remained to fight or suffer under Death Eater oppression. Many chose to remain in the countries where they had found safety, building new lives that incorporated elements of their magical heritage while adapting to different cultural and social environments that offered stability and opportunities that war-torn Britain could not match. The question of what to do with former Death Eater properties and assets created ongoing controversies that reflected deeper disagreements about the appropriate balance between justice and reconciliation in the post-war settlement, as families whose breadwinners had been imprisoned or killed had legitimate claims to financial support for their survival, while victims of Death Eater persecution argued that such resources should be used for reparations rather than maintaining the comfort of people whose previous association with evil had contributed to their current difficulties. The psychological counseling and support services that were established to help war survivors cope with trauma and loss were overwhelmed by demand from people whose suffering had been ignored or suppressed during the conflict, but could no longer be contained. Once relative safety allowed them to acknowledge the full extent of their psychological wounds, the magical medical system was unprepared to address conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder on the scale that the post-war period revealed, while the cultural stigma associated with mental health problems prevented many people from seeking the help they needed to function normally in peacetime society. Children who had been orphaned by Death Eater attacks faced particular challenges in a society that had been so thoroughly disrupted by war that normal support systems for vulnerable individuals had largely collapsed, while the foster care and adoption services that might have provided them with new families were overwhelmed by the number of cases requiring attention. Many of these children grew up in institutional settings that provided basic care, but could not replace the family relationships that violence had destroyed, creating a generation whose development had been shaped by loss and abandonment rather than love and security. The marriage patterns and family formation that characterized the post-war period reflected both the urgency that people felt about rebuilding normal lives and the psychological wounds that made intimate relationships more difficult to establish and maintain successfully. Many couples who had been separated by the war's demands rushed into marriages that might not have occurred under peacetime conditions, while others found that shared trauma created bonds that were stronger than those based on normal romantic attraction and compatibility. The baby boom that followed Voldemort's defeat represented both a natural biological response to the end of existential threat and a conscious choice by many families to invest in future generations as an expression of faith that the both peace they had achieved would prove durable enough to justify bringing children into a world that had so recently been dominated by terror and violence. These children would grow up with no direct memory of the war years, but would be influenced throughout their lives by parents whose worldview had been shaped by experiences that the new generation could never fully understand or appreciate. The cultural productions that emerged during the post-war period reflected the complex mixture of celebration, mourning, and uncertainty that characterized collective attempts to process the trauma and transformation that British magical society had experienced during nearly 11 years of systematic terror and resistance. Books, plays, and musical compositions that dealt with war themes were enormously popular, providing audiences with opportunities to explore emotions and experiences that were difficult to discuss in ordinary social contexts while creating shared frameworks for understanding what they had all lived through together. But the most significant cultural development of the post-war period was the gradual emergence of historical narratives that simplified and mythologized the war years in ways that made them easier to understand and commemorate, while obscuring the moral complexities and institutional failures that had made such widespread evil possible in the first place. The story that developed emphasized heroic individual actions and clear distinctions between good and evil that provided psychological comfort while potentially preventing the kind of critical self-examination that might have led to genuine reforms in the systems and attitudes that had enabled Death Eater's success. The monitoring and surveillance systems that had been established during the war years to detect and counter Death Eater activities were gradually scaled back during the post-war period, but they were never completely dismantled, due to concerns that former Death Eaters might attempt to reorganize, or that new threats might emerge from international sources or domestic radicalization. The balance between security and civil liberties that had been skewed heavily towards security during the emergency years was slowly readjusted, but the precedents established during the war would influence magical government approaches to crisis management for decades to come. The intelligence networks and investigative capabilities that had been developed to fight Death Eater infiltration and terrorism were redirected toward other forms of magical crime. But the expertise and institutional knowledge that had been accumulated during the war years created temptations to apply those same methods to problems that might not have justified such intensive approaches under normal peacetime standards. The normalization of extraordinary investigative powers and surveillance techniques represented a permanent change in the relationship between magical government and magical citizens that would have long-term consequences for individual privacy and civil liberties. The question of Voldemort's ultimate fate remained officially unanswered throughout the post-war period, as the absence of a body and the mysterious circumstances surrounding his defeat left room for speculation about whether his destruction had been complete, or whether he might somehow find ways to return to physical form and resume his campaign of terror and oppression. The few individuals who possessed genuine knowledge about Horcruxes and their implications for the Dark Lord's survival were careful to keep such information secret, understanding that public awareness of the possibility of his return might undermine the fragile psychological recovery that had allowed normal life to resume. But among those who understood the true nature of Voldemort's approach to achieving immortality, there was persistent concern that his defeat had been temporary rather than permanent, creating obligations to maintain vigilance and preparation that conflicted with the broader society's desire to forget the war years and move on to more pleasant preoccupations. The tension between necessary caution and healthy psychological recovery would influence magical politics and social development throughout the period of apparent peace that followed Halloween 1981. The legend of the boy who lived continued to grow throughout the post-war years, fed by public hunger for heroes and symbols of hope that could provide meaning and inspiration during the difficult process of rebuilding broken institutions and damaged communities. But the mythologization of Harry Potter also served to obscure the more complex realities of how his survival had been achieved and what it might mean for future conflicts between good and evil, creating expectations and assumptions that might prove problematic when the child eventually grew old enough to understand the weight of destiny that had been placed on his shoulders through circumstances beyond anyone's control. The peaceful years that followed the Second Wizarding War were both genuine respite from terror and preparation for conflicts that few people wanted to acknowledge might be coming, as the unresolved issues and incomplete justice that characterized the post-war settlement created conditions that would eventually allow old evils to return in new forms, while new generations would have to learn lessons that their parents hoped they would never need to understand. Rest now, young wizard, as our tale of the Second Wizarding War draws to its peaceful close. In the quiet darkness, let yourself be comforted by the knowledge that even in the darkest times, ordinary people found extraordinary courage. Though Voldemort's first reign brought terror and loss, it also revealed the unbreakable bonds of love, friendship, and sacrifice. That light can never be extinguished by darkness. The heroes of this war, James and Lily Potter, the Longbottoms, the Pruitt brothers, and countless others, showed us that some things are worth fighting for, even unto death. As you drift toward dreams, remember that their sacrifice purchased years of peace, and that love, as Dumbledore knew, is the most powerful magic of all. Sleep well, knowing that in your dreams you may find the courage of the Order, the wisdom of those who resisted, and the peace that comes from understanding that good, however tested, endures forever. Sweet dreams, and may you rest in the quiet that heroes died to protect.